And we're live. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, hey everybody. I'm just waiting to see when the stream starts on my end for the YouTube page. All right, there we go.
Yeah, it's got like a
Yeah,
seven
sorry,
sec. It's got a 7 second
but
delay.
yeah, sorry that it's took us a few weeks to get around to streaming again. A lot of stuff going on our end, and I imagine that a lot of stuff's been going on. At least it's felt like there's a lot of stuff that's been going on for all you guys watching as well. State definitely amped up the psyops over social media by 10 ever since the election.
Well, I mean, yeah. We've kind of talked about this before on previous streams, but we have someone joining us to talk about the main topic of the stream. Would you care to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Vanessa, and I'm the founder at Vulpine Labs, and we're developing gene editing systems with freedom of form in mind. We're also part of Put Together, which is a much broader group, basically aimed at the improvement of existence for everyone.
Well, would you like to get into more specifically the methods that you're working on?
Sure. So we're looking at open source, first of all. Everything's going to be open source. And the methods are going to be based on the idea of having a model of the entire body that you build using your own genome. So you input your genetic data, and the system actually reads your genetic code like a cell would, in the sense of simulating out how each process would handle the code. And so it then builds out the body based on its genetic code into a full model, using a few tricks to keep the sheer quantity of data and the sheer amount of processing within reason, but nonetheless creating a good model that you can work from. The reason we call the software suite that builds this model the guess is partly because where it doesn't have enough information from either bioinformatics databases or other sources of data that you've been able to provide it, or from your genome, it will be designed to extrapolate and fill in the gaps with its most logical best guess. But that is intended to be limited enough and to give you warnings when it does that by a large enough amount to matter, so that you're able to make informed decisions about what it is that you're looking at. And this model that you build of your body, you would then be able to have a way of zooming and checking it at different levels. So it works a lot like, say, when you are on Google Earth, and you can look at the entire planet, or you can zoom in and you can see images resolving to where the different countries are, where the different states, counties, cities are. When you zoom in more, you can see the road system, you can see the particular streets, particular houses, and in some cases you can zoom in, down to, say, street view and look at things really up close. The same would apply with the body. You'd be able to do that with this model that you build of your body. So you can actually figure out what's going on at all levels, whatever it is that you choose to change. Because the idea with this model is you should be able to edit your body as if you're editing an avatar, like for, say, a VR system or something like that. But
VR
this
chat.
would be the actual model of your true body. Yeah, VR chat or Second Life or anything like that. Except this would be much more detailed.
I'm imagining a system very similar to VR chat, where you can pick and choose. Like, once this is developed and has had a lot of hands iterating upon it and developing their own systems, that there would eventually be a repository of genes and epigenetics that would allow you to be able to pick and choose which components you want to include within your own genome. So
That's right.
I know for myself, like I have epilepsy, and I'm pretty sure you can imagine epilepsy is not something that I wish to have. So I can just figure out which components of my genome cause epilepsy to emerge, in which case I don't actually think it's genetic. I think it's actually from some disease that I'm not going to get into that I had when I was like 10 years old. And the brain damage that I suffered from that is something that I'm experiencing the after effects of right now. So
Yeah.
if I
I
could just
believe
have if
the
I could just have
epilepsy.
the gene that allows my brain to actually repair damage as opposed to just scarring over it, that would be fantastic.
That's certainly an approach that you should look into. Um, my brother actually suffers epilepsy also, and my understanding of it is that it has a variety of potential causes. One of the more common causes, I think, that can affect it is the immune system in the brain, the astrocytes, um, building up a misfiring of sorts. And they can proliferate in a way that can have a similar effect to what you get with eczema on the skin, or with what was it, Crohn's disease in the stomach. But I know that there are multiple causes, and one of the telltale signs of epilepsy when it comes to the signals in the brain is that they can repeat backward and forward in a kind of resonance through the brain, sort of. You're building up a standing wave, effectively, and it sort of works a bit like tetanus does with the muscles, in that it builds up this standing wave when the actual fit happens. So that's a kind of area to research too, I think. If I had a good research paper to point to about that, I would. But offhand, I can't remember where I got that one from.
I've done a lot of digging into it on my own time, which is how I came to the details that I did about my past medical history and how. I'll just say it. I had I can't remember if it's called encephalial meningitis or meningeal encephalitis. I think that was the latter, and that's the tissue between the skull and the brain that forms a protective barrier.
Yeah.
And what essentially happened is it was an autoimmune disease that caused inflammation, and the after effects of that have been, well, I said it already, brain damage. Nothing that actually impaired cognitive function, but it's definitely causing that resonance that you were describing earlier.
Yeah.
For the record, yes, Ray, I can watch that one Pokemon episode, even though it's banned, but I don't care about banning, so it's okay. You know what I'm referring to, right?
Oh. Obviously, there are different kinds of epilepsy, and photosensitive is just one kind of epilepsy.
Yeah. So I can watch Electric Soldier Porygon no problem. I wouldn't recommend it, but the point is I can.
Well, even if you're not epileptic, the parts of that episode that cause issues, they're like hard to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can give you a headache at least.
And I am actually prone to those, so I prefer to avoid that whenever possible. But yeah, this is the main reason that I wanted to title the stream this way. And you did offer an alternative suggestion that I did like. However, unfortunately, we weren't able to change it due to nobody having access to the title at the time. But yeah, I mean, it's very... Sorry?
I did change it.
Oh, never mind then. My information is out of date.
Change it.
My information is woefully out of date. But yeah, I mean, like what you're talking about
That is a common problem.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah. Just the idea is the implications of this. I think are tremendous for a lot of people with a lot of problems similar to mine. Not just epilepsy, but any kind of problem in the rotting cage of biomatter that people call a body can just simply be
I
fixed
think
by altering
rotting
your
is
own
a bit of a
genetics.
mean way to put it.
Sorry?
I think rotting is a bit of a mean way to put it, unless you've literally got gangrene or something.
Decaying, entropic.
What is decaying from a biological?
Entropic
What is
rotting.
decaying from a cellular perspective? What is decaying if not rotting?
I still think that's a bit of a mean way to put it, because I sort of view rot as being more of a process involving fungus or bacterial sort of degradation of something on a different time scale to the aging that we're seeing here. But nonetheless, I understand that you're getting at aging as a problem.
Yes. It's a problem that,
Yeah.
well, people have been desperate to figure out throughout history and have come up with innumerable ways and attempts to figure out ways to, if not reverse it, then forestall it. I'm sure you've heard. I remember my time in government schools that a lot of the interest in the New World came down to pursuing legends of the Fountain of Youth that supposedly existed.
Well, they got to give people something to chase after, haven't they, if they want to manifest some destiny.
Exactly. So,
Yeah, and that's the thing that the government, I guess, instead of trying to find a solution to that problem, I guess they realized towards the end of the 19th century that once, advanced germ theory had been discovered, that, universities were on a fast track to actually accomplishing that. So instead, they started brainwashing people into a sense of learned helplessness towards their own mortality.
I can tell you
Oh.
who's responsible for that too. You've heard of John Rockefeller, right?
Well,
I've heard the
obviously.
name.
Yeah. Well, he was the one that basically came up with the idea of he wasn't the first to do this, obviously, but he's the most prominent example of my mind because his goal with founding all of these medical programs, all of these universities, and even starting several, setting up medical departments and all that stuff, was not out of any sense of altruism or wanting to give back to the community or whatever. The whole point was that so that he could have a set of doctors, scientists, etc., who were all under his payroll, so that when he formed the pharmaceutical industry as a way of selling petroleum products as quote unquote medicine to people, he could have doctors lining up and tripping over themselves just to say, yes, don't worry, this will cure absolutely everything, I promise. So he basically just
He'd probably not help.
It was a way of basically being able to. You know what Rockefeller did. His whole business was oil and trying to figure out new ways to ruin the world by utilizing oil as the main driving force behind it. Not to say that oil itself and its utilization is a complete and total negative, but the effects of John Rockefeller on humanity has been an absolute catastrophe, and he has been attempting to not only sell us the problem but also sell the cure to the problem that he himself created. Oh, you're coughing because of all of this air pollution that didn't exist previously? Hey, here's this cough syrup made of the same stuff that's used to pollute the air with. Don't you feel better? Because 9 out of 10 scientists that I paid for all say that it's good for you.
Let's also mix it into paint as with lead. I mean, that's what I was just gonna say a moment ago. And probably what helped normalize that quite a bit was around the time frame, how fucking common it was for people to just drop dead because of how deadly industrial products were.
Let's take this to the logical sort of conclusion then. So you've got a whole lot of problems in this world now, from the industrial waste of mad capitalists and profiteers who didn't give a shit about people's actual health, or about the health of the planet, or anything really, except money. And so now we're living in this kind of slow apocalypse that's kind of coming from that, and you got to say, how do we adapt and survive? Because adaptation is one thing that hopefully we're still good at, and I do believe that being able to rewrite our genes is, although certainly not the morally ideal answer, because the morally ideal answer would have been to not get in this mess in the first place. It's I think the best way that we can claw back some agency from this situation, if we do it open source and if we make it available to everyone. And those are very important key concepts in this. It has to be about freedom of form, freedom to choose what you do with your genetics for yourself, and it has to be freely available.
Absolutely. And I think all of us completely agree on that, just for a simple observation that when you look at a lot of the problems that exist in modernity and break it down to who's peddling what product, when, where, and why, you look at it, it's all proprietary, all patented, all copyrighted. You can't look at what it is that's there. You can't see the man behind the curtain. All of that is prevented from you and hidden from you. And if people had the ability to scrutinize what it is that they were actually being able to put into their bodies and be able to take control of that, then they would be able to, as you say, claw back the agency that was taken away from them and distributed to the copyright and patent office to be sold back to you as a product. Like, of course these people,
Exactly.
like the state and various other proprietary organizations have been going, like, tripping over themselves in an attempt to collect data. Not just like your digital footprint, although that's certainly very, very important to them, but you also have companies, big data firms, setting up things like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, etc., where you submit your own DNA samples to them, and then they pretend to tell you what your ancestry is or whatever product that they're peddling to you, even though it's been proven that, like through numerous examples, that apparently the genetics of fruit can somehow turn up an ancestry, a human ancestry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's also been, of course, how all of those companies were exposed to being used by the FBI to sample that data for their own databases. So in a very literal sense, that was just a giant entrapment scheme, those companies are.
Yeah. They were actually set up without any real oversight, and there's a lot of bad faith going on here where they don't actually have any requirement on them to make this open source public data, and it's being used instead against us.
Well, what interest would any proprietary organization have to use it in a way that wasn't nefarious? Their entire business model is dependent on them to create a problem and then sell you the cure. So what they would inevitably do, if there was a way for them to utilize the technology that you are working on and then try to sell it back to you, what will inevitably end up happening is that they'll figure out a way, if they haven't already, to create a copyright and patent for your genetic code. Not just you specifically, but you, dear audience. Your genetics are definitely going to be copyrighted and patented, and if not, then they'll just copyright and patent the genetic modules that you will need to install onto yourself because of the ransom bioware that got installed onto your body. That was also proprietary. It's kind of the same thing with how people who had certain surgeries or just have certain medical treatments need to take these crazy ass regimens of like 20 pills a day just to not die. Only you gotta do that with bioware.
And I think it's exemplified by things like what Martin Shkreli did with taking the price of insulin ridiculously high and the price of that AIDS drug. There's what the company that did those implants for the eyes to make it so that blind or partially sighted people could see better, and then that company went under, and they literally disabled the implants, and I think there was even an attempt to repossess them, which is straight out of Repo the Genetic Opera, isn't it? I mean, except
Yes.
it happened, and that is some insane cyberpunk shit that's going on already over the last few years. This isn't something in the future now. This is something that we've already seen happening.
What do you think's going to happen
And
with
so,
what do you think's going to happen with Neuralink? What's his name?
much the same, I imagine.
Elon Musk's little thing to connect to wire people's brains to the internet. I don't quite remember how that
Yeah, I
thing
mean,
is supposed to work, but you can easily imagine a situation where if the FBI just decides that, oh, this person's a problem, or that you're using it in a way that's improper, or even if you're just, I don't know, piss off Elon Musk, he decides to turn off your brain as a way to ban you from the neuronet.
or at
Yeah,
least
let's be honest. It's gonna be installed probably in the right hemisphere of your brain, and it's going to be used so that the state doesn't need propaganda models in order to emotionally manipulate people. You'll just have a chip in your head that does what the state wants it to. That's how it's going to be used if it's implemented in practice.
especially by this government that's come in recently.
Oh, any government.
But yeah, I just think that this current one is a prime example of the sort of government that would be all too happy to rather overtly take advantage of such things,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that regardless of who's behind it, at the end of the day, you got to understand that if you, as someone with morals and scruples and a conscience, if you don't try to develop and build these tools open source for yourselves and for others, so that it's available to everyone, and so that it's built for the right reasons, from the right place, and with the right kind of protections in place from the start. If you don't do that, then the only version of these tools and the only version of these technologies that becomes available or that exists at all is made by the big corporations and governments and those who have a vested interest that is not in your interest.
Yeah, proprietary gene editing is a species-ending problem in a quite literal
Could
sense.
be. It could well be. Yeah, that's entirely possible.
I don't see it as
Because-
possible. I see it as an absolute certainty.
It's one of many that are present in modern political economies that just create necessity at this point for becoming self-sufficient.
Absolutely, and this self-sufficiency needs to be developed as soon as we can. And I have been trying for the last 17 years to get that urgency across to people, and failing magnificently because I am crap at getting that kind of thing across to people, it seems. So it's nice to talk to people like you who actually kind of get what I'm on about.
Oh, we totally.
So,
I'm not going to make any assumptions here, but I'm under the impression that at least us three, and members of our audience, we get it. We understand that not only is the state's organization model itself an active evolutionary pressure against consciousness, but that the state, as a means of maintaining its organizational model, is also a threat to life itself. And it's going to have to do everything that it does, no matter how destructive, because the people in it, they aren't necessarily evil, destructive, malicious, or any of those things, because those are just archetypes. They are put themselves.
The cumulative.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, they just have a career, and they want to be able to put food on the table for themselves and their families. Unfortunately, their career is to engage in malicious activity.
And we can already see with the incentives of proprietary organization models as they exist, just simply extend this into a future scenario where they've also incorporated gene editing directly into the methods that they use to sustain themselves and products that are being sold in the market. Well, from the perspective of in any proprietary organization model, norms existing independent from the norms of behavior that sustain itself are just seen at best as a source of risk and at worst as a destabilizing influence on the organization itself. So techniques that are developed by people acting around these incentives are necessarily going to trend towards taking away literally the ability for your brain to process control over yourself, your own
Well,
perception, and how it goes on to create meaning.
Isa, for the sake of pointing this out to everyone here, do not put it past governments or companies or whoever chooses to do a gene drive against the human population in any way they see fit. Because sooner or later somebody will. A gene drive is when you have a collection of gene edits and you put it out there into the wild, into the population in a way that spreads deliberately.
Yes.
And they're already on about doing that with mosquitoes, which they have a noble enough reason to do that, is to get rid of malaria. But the side effects of doing so are going to be noticeable on the ecosystem for sure. And
They completely ignore their stated intent or purpose. Simply look at that. The fact that they can manufacture mosquitoes that by biting somebody can transmit a disease that then affects the way that their body functions from a cellular perspective.
I mean, consider
that would be a a reversal of the stated purpose, obviously. But I can see the possibility of it for sure.
I mean, it's already been done though. There's well, I can't really necessarily make this claim since I don't have the documents to prove it. But I'll just say that there was a rumor that the original release of Lyme's disease was due to genetic engineering.
There are rumours about several diseases being potentially from genetic engineering. Whether they are or aren't isn't necessarily the point anyway. The main point is
The fact that it's possible.
any given disease could arise from such a source, and you have to be prepared for that to occur as
There needs to be
a
countermeasures.
threat in your threat model.
Exactly.
I
It
mean,
comes
The
down
technology needs to be available to everyone, or else there are no countermeasures.
It needs to be something that people understand in the way that they understand how to use a first aid kit. It's not something that you can just leave to the professionals. It's
Exactly.
a skill that people need to learn.
It's like good practice in cybersecurity. Teaching people to even use antivirus on their computers or to make backups. That's simple things to those who are technically minded, and yet it takes 20, 30 years to really get the general population up to speed on doing it as a general habit.
Yeah.
And likewise, when it comes to your genetic, your bio cybersecurity or just your biosecurity in general, you're going to need some good habits in that, and you're going to need them fast because the technology is moving fast, and therefore so are the threats.
Exactly. I completely agree.
I
There should be the capacity to be able to update your own immune system.
I also know
Exactly,
that
and that's part of what the guests should be able to do.
I am aware that there's also talk. I don't know how far this is in development, but there is interest in biopharmaceutical organizations of self-spreading vaccines, not self-amplifying, self-spreading, where they essentially get released into an ecosystem and spread like a virus. But
That is
the idea is just
obviously-
like a benevolent virus that makes you immune to other
Yeah.
diseases. However, I'm pretty sure you can see what the problem is, since what they're essentially openly admitting within that framework is a bioweapon. that's going to be
They want
altering,
to Windows
altering people
update your
genetically.
body.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
like, forget it. Like, just they're not even considering the concept of consent anymore. Like, that just completely being thrown
Yeah,
out the window.
Which is why I was saying, gene drives against the human population or against any, intelligent life in general is going to just be a thing they're going to do because, any effort to claim that morals and scruples state that you should or must have, you know, consent first, that sort of thing is regarded by a lot of these corporations as ethical hand wringing, pearl clutching. Oh, think of the children, and they're not going to stand for 1 second on one side and wait for people around the world to gradually catch up morally and in terms of their understanding of the ethics to decide whether this should or shouldn't happen. That's not how these people operate, and I'm coming at this from a perspective of saying, if we are up against a world that is so lacking in these kinds of morals and scruples and considerations, then we cannot hold ourselves in a position where we're waiting on the same standards that they won't wait for, in order to develop an open source system and make it available, because we don't have the time for that. If we wait, we're going to lose the chance to protect ourselves against whatever is coming our way genetically. And, the risks that are associated with all these drives and edits and bioweapons that could be flung at us. So I see it as an imperative morally, actually, to make sure that people have access to these tools, that people learn how to use them, that they are easy to use, and that they're open source so that no one can lock them away and say, haha, this is all, under our patents now and you're not allowed to touch it.
Haha, unleashes zombie plague that only we have the cure for. Literally like a fucking umbrella corp.
Well, indeed, that's if you can picture the horror story, some psychopath out there who happens to have money and facilities has the potential to do it.
Yeah.
So
You name dropped one
Which means
already,
that
Martin Shkreli.
yeah, Martin Shkreli was an example of obviously just sheer greed and laughing at people's inability then to survive because he couldn't afford the drug. And after he was actually taken down a peg or 10 by, the courts dragging him through a hedge backwards, as it were, he decided, okay, I'm going to go to cryptocurrency instead, which I think sort of exemplified where his mind was at. But it's hardly an improvement when you consider what the cryptocurrency mining is doing to the environment as well, with the sheer energy use. So,
And somebody needs to make that more efficient.
yeah, I mean, it's funny because originally when I was designing the guest, I was thinking in terms of like, how can we network between users of the system so that everyone can share these gene edits to each other, and make sure that there's an easy way to download them on a peer-to-peer basis. And I had the idea for a little while of associating that with a cryptocurrency, but that was back before I realized just how easy it is for cryptocurrencies to be essentially used in a fraudulent way and to be more of a scourge on the planet than they are a help. So
Well, the problem with
that requirement from the system now. I've removed that idea from the system because I don't think it's that necessary, and I don't think that incentivizing people to make gene edits for each other has to come down to any kind of currency per se anyway. I think that it needs to be done differently.
Yeah, I mean that would certainly be complicating the technique a bit, and if you want and as many people to be able to just pick it up as possible and use it for themselves, then it needs to be it needs to require as little specialization as and input cost as possible. Sort of like the thought process behind us, designing a lot of our methods. But yeah, just what I was going to say is that itself, like the problem with a lot of cloud mining operations is because of the strain that those computers needing to be hooked to a proprietary cloud server for those to be profitable operations in the context of a legal economy put on computers, and how many computers are required for it to be profitable.
Yeah, it fast grew out of control because although I think the initial stated intent was to consider that every individual user would be able to contribute to the mining of of the currency in the system, in practice, of course, it's all going to gravitate to whoever has the most money, the most computers, the most energy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that cryptocurrencies specifically are one of the techniques and technologies that exemplifies how the proprietary infrastructure of the internet itself is a problem that's going to affect virtually all attempts at setting up software and hardware people create, unless they explicitly make them distributed or decentralized in some way that doesn't allow them that doesn't depend on them needing to connect to a proprietary server.
That's right, and that's why we switched to a distributed hash table model, which is basically the same kind of setup that the Pirate Bay and torrents use, because that's much more peer-to-peer in how it approaches things, and it doesn't require that you have all this expensive and difficult encryption going on, but you can still encrypt what you're sending in a way that prevents it being mishandled or whatever.
It's not a problem with the capability of the hardware or the software. It's the strain that's put on your system by everything needing to be designed around bottlenecks. And just I wanted to clarify that if we're going to be talking about like the proof of work blockchain decentralized cryptocurrencies, well, they weren't designed to be used for speculation. They were designed so that after the financial system eventually collapses, there's a medium of exchange that is decentralized that exists.
Yeah, and of course the financial system wouldn't let cryptocurrencies cause it to collapse, and it found that the best way to prevent that happening was to inflate them out of reach from the common person before the common person could get hold of them and collapse the financial system by using them for everything, and instead turn them into another commodity that's traded on the stock market or similar. And that is kind of just capitalism's own way of preventing anything other than the existing currency model from really.
It's a perfect example of
medium exchange.
It's a perfect example of the influence of technique as we've been trying to explain this concept to people, and how it, like, the political economy and the state both have to be approached as though they're essentially the same problem, and the effect that they're having on the entire environment around them needs to be considered as just a holistic system where every single part of it needs to be considered in terms of how the state is using it to prop itself up, and how proprietary organization models that are propped up by the political economy interact with the state based on their own incentives.
Exactly, and you've got to be realistic when you're modeling the body as well. When you working out what's going on genetically, it's not enough to say, okay, I understand that this gene looks different. You've got to say, what does that do to the proteins? What does that do to the cells? What does it do to the organs, the whole body? And furthermore, if I actually do this edit, and I figure out what does it do to me and my life and my body, how's that going to affect what I can then achieve, what I can do on a macro scale as well? These things matter. So you can't model all of that in the guess, but you can certainly model enough of it that you should have an idea then of where you can go from there. What does it mean to you, and what you can become, what you can transform yourself into. And I think that being able to try this out from a genetic level is one thing, but also you got to be able to essentially just draw on the body. Say, okay, I want a tail now, and then say, to the guess, how do I make that happen? How do I get from 0 to tail on the back of this model of the body? And it should figure out genetically the processes that it would have to go through. And I think
remember exactly
the world need to do the same thing. They need to get from how they are now to how they need to be. You've got to figure out how you unfold the process in between without completely ruining everything in such a way as you can't get to the end. So that sort of whole kind of from A to B via the rest of the alphabet sort of routing has to be carefully calculated. That said, it's got to be done quickly, because you don't want to be spending forever trying to figure it out and then losing the chance to do it.
Well, everything every phenomena that could be repeatedly observed exists because of something that caused it, based on its characteristics to be defined, and the characteristics that defined it, that it emerged out of, are then going to go on to influence what its existence, what the implications of its existence establishes for any other concepts around it, because the characteristics that define its existence are going to define how it influences anything that it interacts with. So really, every concept needs to be approached that way, but especially governments. You can't just treat one aspect of how it's influencing the environment around it as though that is just a singular problem that exists in and of itself.
Yeah, indeed, and that's why we have to... Go on.
Okay. I think I read somewhere that it was found exactly what caused humans to not have tails was a specific jumping gene inserting itself in one of the sequences that defines the length of the tail, and thus making it so that the tail length variable in the genome was 0.
Yeah, it may be that simple, although I think in practice there's a few other genes since then that were sort of defining other aspects of the tail that have kind of become, locked away effectively and need to be reactivated. But that is just obviously what's in the human genome, and it depends a lot on what it is precisely you want to do with your body. What is it you want it to become? Do you want it to be a mostly human body that just happens to look like a particular way, a particular animal or something, have certain characteristics that look like that animal? Or do you want to make it so that it's more like you've actually transformed it as much of the way as possible to being that animal without maybe losing your brain or something?
Or even just something like not wanting to be a humanoid entity at all anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Some people are going to go for something a lot more esoteric.
Yeah.
And it's like you could... The sky's the limit when it comes to what you could potentially become or change yourself into. But some people are just going to want to simply get rid of cancer susceptibility, without really changing their appearance or anything. Or they're going to want to just solve a few basic issues in their genome. Get rid of epilepsy, get rid of eczema, etc. And that's okay too, and we should be catering for everything from that to the extreme sort of transhumanist and posthuman sort of concepts as best we can with this. And the best way to do that is to let the people really kind of develop these things for themselves, much like they develop mods for games and distribute them. I think that some of the gene mods that people are going to develop are going to be great, and some of them are going to be crap, because you've got a whole wide range of people with different sets of skills who are going to pay attention in different ways to the warnings and the ways that the models display things to them. And so,
But one of the points,
need
I
to
guess
sort
one of
of
the
say what it does, but then that's going to vary depending on who you apply it to as well, depending on your own genome and how you mix it with that. So you can't just blame it on who designs the changes. You've got to actually be ready to alter them yourself to make them work for you as well.
Yeah, and one of the points that I wanted to start placing a lot of emphasis on is that this isn't just some abstract notion that's defined by an urgent concern that we can observe presently in our environment. Sort of like the Four Thieves Vinegar Collective and the situation that would put anybody trying to practice medicine in a DIY environment. The context that they provided through the techniques they've developed introduces to your methods. The methods that you've developed also allow people to pick this up with very little. I mean, of course, there's trial and error involved in learning how it works, but it's not too complicated, would you say? And it's also not too cost intensive.
I slightly lost track of what you were talking about. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. Let me try to rephrase that. So, Four Thieves Vinegar Collective is a group that we talked about on previous streams where they've provided a bunch of techniques and blueprints which anyone can download, and they share quite a bit to make various different, mostly chemical compounds designed to be used as treatments in medicine.
Right.
And I was just comparing their methods to what's been developed here, and I was going to ask if you would say that this what you've developed or what you're working on is going to have a similar impact on gene modification, where someone can just pick it up with very little technical knowledge, basically just a bit of experimentation, and also light reading about how it works from a technical perspective, and then can start creating.
That's the intention in a way, and it's also necessary. I think we should take a look at what happened in software development and the operating systems in the early 90s. You had Microsoft Windows and Apple Mac OS were developing, since the 80s. You had the GNU suite of software applications that were originally developed with Unix and Unix-based systems in mind. And then Linus Torvalds comes along with the Linux kernel and makes it available under the GNU General Public License. And suddenly you have something to put together with those GNU tools to make an operating system that doesn't need a specific company backing it. And you have a whole collection of geeks and nerds who are able to outfit themselves with whatever they need software-wise without needing companies to, actually sell them that software or support it per se, although many companies did end up setting up anyway to do that with Linux because they could. They weren't the be-all and end-all, and you could have as many companies as you wanted doing that. There was no specific sort of lock and key to hold away the availability of it from people. And we want to really make the Linux of gene editing here, and at a time when really gene editing is at an even earlier stage than it was in the early 90s with software. So
need to be able to have a template of the human genome that can be run as a virtual machine.
In
basically.
effect, but we want it to be one that obviously you can have a generic human genome, that there is such a thing. It's made available by, I think it's NCBI, and
You link that.
attempt to find it, but it might take me a while. It's been a long time since I actually looked it up. Because I haven't needed to for a while because I've been busy with other parts of the system. But what did they call it again? I'm just trying to look it up because I'm curious actually now. There's a particular code they use. I think it's something like GRCH38 or something like that. But I'm probably wrong with the exact letters, but it's something that sounds similar to that, where they have this reference model of the body, this reference genome that they use as a kind of generic human. And
Oh, you were right.
They download.
GRCH38.
Yeah, that's the one. There we go. So they've probably got a newer version by now than 38. 38 is just one I remember. But yeah, that model of the genome is meant to be an average, basically, between many people's different genomes. And so that's there as a reference model for doing a lot of genomic research without having to use someone's specific data. And that can be very handy when you're trying to do something generalized. But everybody has a different genome. Nobody's genome is that specific genome.
Not only that, but you also have epigenetics to take in consideration as well.
Yes, although ultimately the epigenetics are controlled by the genetics, because the genetics set what the proteins are and what the other sort of handling of the substances are via those proteins to actually build your epigenetics in the first place. So it's a bit chicken and egg, but there is at the base of it a genomic sequence for everything. It's just many layers down. So it's worth remembering that the way that cells handle things doesn't necessarily make the most sense possible. It isn't always the most efficient thing possible. It's often a very Byzantine bureaucracy of proteins that hand things off one to another to actually get the job done.
Yeah. Basically like a compiler compiling a compiler compiling a compiler. So many layers of slowdown, but it still gets the job done.
Yeah, because that's it's. I'll tell you what exemplifies it on a slightly bigger scale is the laryngeal nerve. It wraps down around the aorta, and yet it goes from the brain to the larynx, the voice box. So
Wait,
why
what?
is it going all the way down to the heart and wrapping around the aorta just to go up again? And the answer is to do with where the aorta, the brain, and the larynx used to be relative to each other back in the days of simplified versions of fish, hundreds of millions of years ago.
Ah, shit.
And
That's so messed up.
What you have is just a dependency that cannot be severed in any generation of animals. And so, because it has to remain connected and can't just be severed for a generation or two while it gets to the other side, you end up with it wrapped around every time. And particularly if you look at the way that embryos develop, what they start out as the nerve going in a sensible direction, and then it just gets pulled and pulled and pulled the more they grow. And when you look at the most extreme example, the giraffe, you can see the problem that's happening. And the same apparently happened with the long-necked dinosaurs too. You end up with a huge delay in speech or sounds being made by the mouth compared to when the signal is produced at the brain to actually tell it to do that, because of just how long the neuron. So that is an example of the kinds of problems that build up in evolution that evolution itself can't fix, but we can. And we could fix them with a genetic code that is custom written custom designed. Move that nerve by making a copy of it on the other side first. And that's the sort of thing that evolution won't do because it isn't given enough evolutionary pressure to do it. It isn't given enough reason to do it.
It's not taking the shortest path it's not taking the shortest path because its concept of efficiency is what previously worked and then iterating on that.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting just to look at historical biology, or rather evolution from a historical perspective, and you realize that it's essentially a computer whose operating system is just a series of patchworks that goes back literally billions of years. It's a patch built on top of a patch and built on top of a patch going back, and you just can't help but realize that it's not a lean, mean, efficient machine. There's a term for this, it's very clunky. It's very hacked together. The fact that it works at all is nothing short of a miracle.
That's why anyone, particularly, I'm sort of looking askance at fascists here at this point. Anyone who claims that humanity, or any subset thereof, is some kind of evolutionary pinnacle, or that any other creature for that matter is, they are deluding themselves to a ridiculous degree.
Even the evolutionary biologists would agree that that's an absurd claim, because evolution doesn't really give a crap about how effective you are, how intelligent you are. Its primary focus is adapting to their environment, which in that way the human is as well adapted to its environment as any piece of bacteria. I mean, if you want to go through a pure number standpoints, like bacteria have overwhelmingly been the most successful out of just about any organism. If you want to go even further, viruses are quite effective as well.
Yeah, but just because we're successful doesn't. Yeah, just because we're successful doesn't mean we're at the end of the road of our evolution, though.
Yeah,
I mean, someone worked out that if we carry on with what natural selection would probably logically do for us, we're going to end up looking like a certain model known as Graham. And you can look up the Graham model of potential future human evolution. It's quite amusing. But it is just one example of what could happen. And
no.
Did you look it up?
Yes. I wish I hadn't.
Can you show me a picture?
I'll do better. I'll show you the Wikipedia article.
Oh God, yeah, I've seen that before.
Yeah, probably.
It's,
I mean, one of the main problems that since we came back to making content more regularly that we've been trying to expose to people, basically that there are belief systems which, if one constructs the perception of, as a result of constructing the perception of that, it changes the brain in such a way where the brain starts to be biased towards beliefs outside of your conscious perception by way of how your right hemisphere reacts to future perceptions. Well, that right there is a perfect example of a problem that emerges as a result of how stupid human biology is. But it's also another species-ending issue that's being deliberately exacerbated by the state. And yes, taken to its conclusion of consciousness just being completely oblated in the human species, this is probably what the future of humanity looks like.
So that is one example. Obviously, there are other examples that don't look like that, but different people have made these models for different reasons. But my point is, I think that we shouldn't be just letting the natural selection just go willy-nilly into whatever it becomes on its own. Yes, that should be an option, because some people are going to like that. Some people are going to want that for religious reasons or because they just think it's cool. Fine, let them be Graham, let them be whatever else they want to be. But I think that there should be more than that. We should also have diversity that we increase deliberately as a kind of antidote to what the likes of fascists would try to do, which would be to obviously reduce diversity. We should be looking at what can we do to increase genetic diversity and diversify and speciate in the sense of our self-expression, our self-actualization, and the beauty of what it is that we feel we are inside. How can we become that more? And that is what I think is at the heart of freedom of form as a concept. And so I see that combined with adaptation to new environments, that we deliberately design those adaptations for ourselves so that we are, not suffering the indignities of waiting on natural selection to figure it out. And instead we get to actually choose what is optimal to our own perception of what we need when we go to somewhere like Mars or asteroids or other star systems or wherever, or when we're simply trying to survive on Earth in the ever more industrially messed up situation it's in, with various chemicals and pollutants, microplastics, the ozone layer being messed up on and off depending on how many CFCs are being released at the time, the climate change problems, of course, with increased temperature, and the need to colonize different areas simply because of what's available as well. I mean, overpopulation and so on. There's some people saying, we're going to end up living at the bottom of the sea, or we're going to be living at the poles. And it's like, you got to adapt to that. You're going to be in a different place where you've got different needs. And that's even within the Earth. That's something that people don't always appreciate the effect of it. You can move to different places on this planet. You can get culture shock. You can get, climate shock just from that. But the more extreme those places are, the more you've got to adapt to it to really be effective, efficient, and able to survive without it really being a nightmare. So one of the things that I want to point out about our ability to edit our DNA is we will be able to reduce our need not just for drugs, but also for cosmetics, and more importantly, clothes. Look at the effect that making clothes has on the environment. If you
just
have
quick
a body that can actually cope with extremes of temperature or whatever, you don't need as many clothes.
I'm just an aside really quick. I posted the image of Project Graham on the stream so that people can see what we were talking about previously. And yeah, it is unpleasant.
It's different.
If the species evolved to survive car crashes.
Well, hey, I survived 10.
I don't know.
Is this what it would look like after? I mean, this isn't taking away from the previous point that we were making, but is this just somebody who's been in 10 cars? Is that the idea here?
No, it's the idea.
The idea
It's
this is natural selection evolution of someone who is ideally adapted to survive in a world where car crashes are the main selective force.
I'm surprised that humans just didn't evolve into crabs.
Well, they will again at some point, I'm
You
sure.
saying we didn't already?
Why not Zoidberg?
God, what was that? What was that like toy line that was promoted by the government in the late '80s, early '90s? That was based on crash test dummies. Is this like the government creating the future version of that product line?
Oh, I know what you're talking about, but I don't remember the name.
People that are genetically engineered to be crash test dummies and then made for entertainment, just so that they could be put deliberately in car crashes.
That's
I
kind
think
of
I remember a
bizarre.
cartoon being about that.
Yes, there
Yeah, that's
was.
what I mean. There
I
was
know.
there was like a cartoon and a toy line about it, but I have no idea. This is gonna bother me until I look it up, so I'm gonna look it up now. AVGN made a video about it. That's how I know what they are.
The Incredible Crash Dummies. That's what it's called.
Yeah, that's it.
And apparently, the
This is like
cartoon
this is
aired
like
in
the
the early '90s.
this is the 22nd century version of that.
Oh my god.
I mean, you might laugh, but somebody somewhere is probably going to find it incredibly useful to become Graham. And, that might be their freedom of form, their choice.
Yeah,
If that works for them, let them be Graham. Even
yeah.
if it is just so they get a pass to Sontaran in some future version of Doctor Who.
I think the important I think the important takeaway here, especially for our audience, is that the emergence of consciousness as a phenomena not only allows for individuals to be able to self-direct their own instincts and define their own perspectives and develop the rules consciously thereof, but it also allows them to be able to allows us to be able to develop the tools needed to be able to not only direct the evolution of other species, but to direct our own evolution, not only as a species, but just as an individual, to define your own to have the selection, or sorry, to have the pressures of natural selection be decided consciously by yourself, and then transform yourself to achieve the abilities and attributes that are desirable to whatever goal that you're attempting to achieve. The point is to, like, in the same way that reactionaries push back against people having a non-static sense of identity, reactionaries are for sure gonna push back against people having a non-static form, and that's ultimately what this represents. Just people being able to direct the form that they take in order to better adapt to whatever pressures exist within any environment that they're given. Some of those changes might be subtle. You might be optimizing some of the defects that exist in evolution. Some might be so dramatic that it might even be borderline unbelievable that such an individual could have even been a human in the first place. Hell, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a couple people that are going to be cosplaying as space aliens, specifically with these tools. Which would honestly be kind of
And
hilarious.
maybe cosplay isn't quite the way that some of us would like to see it go, on account of having a more sort of deeper spiritual connection to our reasons to want to change. But nonetheless, some people will probably take great pleasure in being able to change multiple times. And, to that end, eventually I see it being possible to incorporate the capabilities of these tools in a more sort of compact way. Picture, if you will, an electronic circuit, or say, for example, a mobile phone. That electronic circuit is obviously quite complex, but it's well defined. You can get, the schematics from somewhere, or you can make them yourself. There are open source phones out there now, and you can work out how all of the components interact, how they interface, how they work.
But
You can actually take genetic code and the way that encodes proteins and other structures to be built in the cells, and you can actually make circuits out of the biological components in cells. And you can get those circuits to function as logic gates. You can get them to function as essentially resistors, capacitors, transistors, and so on and so forth, in a way that means you can make a circuit that carries out the same function as an electronic circuit, and you can even make it electronic. You can have biological grown electronics that are encoded in your DNA. or you can, do it by another mode of sort of chemical interaction if you'd rather it not be directly electronic. It really depends on the application as to what works better. But that means you can genetically encode a mobile phone or the functions of one into your body or into your brain or into a new organ that you attach next to the brain, sort of internally in the head somewhere, if you can find the space or make the space. You could...
But Heretic,
you could do this with other devices.
But Heretic, it's God's will to let the government rape your psyche until you're incapable of judging them for raping children.
Well, dang it, should have known better.
Yeah, it's very convenient how in the context of Judeo-Christianity, God's will so conveniently always lines up with the interests of the state.
I'm sorry, but this does seem to be a slight tangent from what I was saying. Is someone speaking in the...
Yeah, it's a bit of a non sequitur, but I've been waiting to say that.
Sorry, it just kind of threw me off. Well, I wanted to finish this point by saying that if you can make any device in biology, then you can have things like, obviously, telepathy by being able to directly control this built-in phone, so to speak, all the way through to if we can basically biologify the computers, the software, and the gene editing tech itself, the actual ability to produce the gene editing vectors. If you can turn that into a biological device that is encoded in your DNA, then you have shapeshifting.
Exactly what I've been hinting at with people.
What you essentially have is a self-directed biological singularity. You have all of the technologies necessary to be able to modify your own genes as a result of having previously modified your genes. So instead of developing a computer that builds another computer that's smarter than itself recursively, you are the computer that improves upon itself endlessly.
Yes. And that is what I have been trying to get at for the last 17 years, is that the singularity doesn't have to be AI. It doesn't have to be, all silicon. Because the funny thing is, hardware, as we know it in our computers, doesn't live as long as our bodies do. It actually dies sooner because it wears out, because it isn't really designed to cope that long for the majority of machines. They don't. Either that or it becomes obsolete because the software develops too fast and it can't adapt and update enough to cope with the newer software.
Nor can it self-repair or update the hardware.
Yeah, exactly. And so you look at the body, and you look at biology, and you say, well, this clearly has some advantages here in the ability to self-repair, in the ability to self-update and improve and learn. And, people are trying to sort of replicate that in limited hardware contexts. Yet what they're gradually gravitating towards is more and more biomimicry. I just say cut to the chase. Let's use what we already have that we know works, our genes, our biological matter, as the medium of the singularity.
I agree. You're probably one of the only other people I've met that has so fully matched what I have been trying to describe to everyone else.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I'm very happy that we ended up meeting you and finding out about your project, because aside from like performing surgeries, gene modification was one of the areas where, in becoming self-sufficient in the production of medicine, we admittedly were lacking. But this resolves that, so I'm very thankful.
Well, someone's got to do it at some point. If it ain't me, then it's going to end up being, some military that decides it wants super soldiers, or some pharmaceutical corporation that decides it wants to lock away this ability for its own specific gene patented purposes, you know.
Oh, we've already. I can. You want to know about the super soldiers?
I know about them already. It's fucking obvious that they're being developed. It's just a matter of who decides to actually put them on the battlefield in an overt way, where it's obvious that they are indeed super soldiers, and when.
Oh, that happened right after the Napoleonic Wars. It wasn't even a biological thing. It was entirely indoctrination through the Prussian model of education. The whole point of that was just to create soldiers who would be blindly and mindlessly obedient to the state.
Oh, obedience is one thing, but, you know, super strength, unfair advantages, those are another. And, you know, some people have said for quite a while now that the US's army has some suspicious unfair advantages. There's an awful lot of talk that the Chinese are trying to do something like that with their army, and I'm pretty sure that behind the scenes, a lot of militaries now have been working on this kind of thing, you know, in their works, so to speak. And it's something where common people need a chance to catch up, because otherwise you end up with an unfair disparity and a situation where people won't be able to overthrow a tyrant because the tyrant will be protected by such an unfairly advantaged group. So I think that if we want to maintain a world where we can actually have agency and have a chance to fight back against the things that go wrong, then we have to have access to these kinds of tools because the arms race doesn't end.
It does
That
end,
includes
but only when everybody is dead. But I do actually have a very. It kind of occurs to me that all of these super soldier projects, like whether it's a super soldier serum or some other genetic modification, just specifically to create space marines or something ridiculous like that, they're all going to have one thing in common, which is that the techniques and technology that they're going to be used are going to be closed source, hidden behind layers and layers of classification. What this inevitably means is that there's not going to be iteration, there's not going to be change, and they're not going to be seeking to do anything other than improve upon a base template if they even find that to be a useful allocation of their resources, which basically means that if a pathogen were to be developed or even just evolve in the environment that affects those super soldiers specifically, if it affects one of them, it's going to affect all of them, and there's not a damn thing they'll be able to do about it.
Yeah. Or at least a whole group of them that had that particular variety of I know what you mean. And you look at what's happening with Monsanto with their crops, you know, they run the same kind of risk. And, you know, their answer is always, oh, you can't just take the seeds from the last year's crop. You've got to buy the next year's crop and plant it again. How convenient. You make more money, Monsanto. Great. I wonder why that is. But, you know, there's going to be a lot of this kind of entrapment, a lot of these kinds of contracts and things going on. Sorry, I was just in a flow. Go on.
So no wonder why more people are buying heirloom crops, because they can actually reproduce them.
Yeah.
Not to mention that the genetically modified crops, I've been hearing about how, like a couple years ago, I don't remember when this was, but this was like well before COVID, they were talking about golden rice and what a great innovation that was, like crazy crop yields, all that stuff. And then come around COVID, it comes out that golden rice has basically just destroyed ecosystems. Like you just straight up can't plant things other than golden rice on those fields anymore because they're just completely unusable.
Why? What happened? I haven't heard about this.
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. My information is probably like several years out of date, but my understanding is that golden rice and other Monsanto GMO crops are extremely nutrient inefficient, and they will just consume everything. They're basically like locusts for plants. They're like locusts of plants.
I wonder why they have to make it so that they're really hard to reproduce, so that they don't fucking destroy the planet.
I think their interest is more along the lines of maintaining shareholder value, and I think this is one of the things that is worth bringing up in this stream. I mentioned it on previous streams, but I think to you, like you're familiar with, what's the term here? Why am I blanking on it? Fiduciary responsibility.
Oh.
Mm.
Well, who are you asking?
I am asking. Why can't I click on the name?
I'm Atta.
Yeah,
You know about me?
Sorry, I'm very bad with names. Yeah, Atta. You know what fiduciary responsibility is?
Mm-hmm. It's one of the greatest tragedies of capitalism.
Yeah, it's literally making it so firms in the legal economy have that a property title exists that is defended by the state, which gives people investing in a company an entitlement to returns.
If you
It's why you shouldn't. It's why you shouldn't become a publicly traded company.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like slavery of extra steps.
It really
It
is.
basically is.
I actually had a coworker at one point at my white market job who used to work at a company. It was a local company, but eventually they went public. And overnight, there was just a complete culture shift where previously, like, everybody was very casual. You could do what you wanted, and they were very loose with how they did things, and they were still very successful, very profitable, that sort of thing. All the kind of benchmarks you would want in a private company. But because the owner died, gave it to his son, who then sold it off to some management firm. I can't quite remember the details. Who then had the company go public. Suddenly they became very bureaucratized, very strict dress code. You had deadlines, you had quotas, you had all of this stuff, and it was just complete shift within 1 week. And it went from a shop to a factory, and it just became soul crushing almost instantly. And that is just the internal effect of going public, that from one person that I've known personally. That's anecdotal, so feel free to take it with a grain of salt. However, it does demonstrate one of the really demonic incentives that exists within proprietary organizations and what's necessary for maintaining their grasp on their property titles. Sorry, you were going to say something?
I know quite a few beings who identify as demons who would have an issue with the term demonic being used in such a context.
Yeah, you're
because
right. That's an insult to demons.
You know, I don't think that's very fair. Yeah, I don't think it's very fair at all.
How about Bill Gatesian? Point is, they were engaging in behavior that is incredibly destructive and detrimental to anyone who isn't a child molesting sociopath.
Yeah. Well, what a wonderful world we're living in, and we have a lot of things to fix. And this conversation is really sort of attacking the list.
Well, I mean,
isn't it?
Yeah. I've actually kind of figured out something that simplifies our to-do list quite significantly, which is attempt to fix yourself and fix the people around you first.
Mm-hmm.
Which basically means that I've kind of described it years ago, but I think it's worth reiterating now, and you definitely have not heard of it. It's basically just to become invulnerable, to their ability to control you, to apply pressures on your life. Now, of course,
And then,
true
if you
invulnerability
do
is
that,
not a reasonable expectation, but the point is that you take steps to mitigate their ability to affect you personally. They can pass whatever legal fan fiction or want. Courts can ban this and restrict that and regulate whatever. But what matters fundamentally is their ability to enforce it and to
yeah,
how it
because
affects
if
your
you can
life.
divorce yourself from their effect on you, then as a free person, you can then have the agency to do things that other people can't do in this system, and that can include, fermenting a movement or building up some kind of process by which things change. So then you can be that nucleus of a snowball effect.
No, yeah, I mean, people are going. What's inevitably going to end up happening is that those same pressures that are going to be driving us to invulnerability against the state is going to be noticed by the people who are in our circles. And not all of them, of course. In fact, we're going to experience a lot of pushback against this, not only by people who are emotionally invested in politics, but also just by narcissists. Like, a lot of narcissists. Holy crap, so many of them. But
Yep.
also, but there are going to be people who are going to be genuinely interested, who are going to see that, hey, wait a minute, how come this isn't bothering you? And then you open that up, just like, well, I don't actually need to I actually don't need to refill my medication anymore because I have this device at home that prepares all of the medication that I need for me. And that's just like a short term thing.
Yeah.
In longer term, like you can imagine, it's just like, hey, I've known you for 10 years and you haven't aged a day. What the heck is going on? Oh, I did this thing that made aging not a thing in my body anymore. Would you like to know how?
Yeah, it's even simpler than a dispute. It's not even really a dispute over ideals in terms of like the method that it's going to spread. It's going to be a self-fueling process because every part of the method that we're spreading around that would allow someone to become economically self-sufficient is capable of making copies of every single one of its own components. That would mean that it's not I guess revolution, for lack of a better way of putting it, that exists on an idealistic basis. It's one that's defined by an economic and psychological basis. And what in practice
basis too.
what in practice that translates to, though, is it's not even something that people would adopt because, like, they could hate it all that they want. That's not the reason why people are going to be setting them up for themselves. The reason people are going to be setting them up for themselves is because they basically eliminate all your bills. I mean, you could you could say whatever you want about about investment in a legal economy. There is no situation where anyone is going to be able to achieve an end for themselves where they can genuinely say they're not indebted to anybody, and that doesn't come at the cost of being involved in some nefarious investment, some nefarious scheme that involves the CIA or something.
Let me present to you a very realistic scenario that I think a lot of people will relate to. Someone is going to know somebody in their immediate or less than immediate family who has cancer. And then they'll bring it up with their coworkers or circle of friends. And then someone in that circle of friends will bring up, oh, cancer? Oh, just bring your aunt over to my house. I'll have it looked at. And probably by the end of the day, I'll have an injection that they can take. Maybe even just some thing that they just drink. And we'll take a look at the cancer again in 48 hours, and it should be good by then.
That's entirely a possible outcome. And I'm very much looking forward to, to being in this situation where getting rid of a genetic disorder is on the same level as 3D printing something is now. Where maybe, it's still something that is more done by the enthusiasts, but there's plenty of them around, and it's easy enough to find someone with one. And before long, eventually it'll get to the point where everyone has them, like everyone has 2D printers in their office.
I'd like to get to the point where people have formulas laying around their house in the same way that they have antibiotics.
Yeah, or recipes for food. Yeah. Like, I think that pharmaceutical drugs themselves are going to have a lot less need if we can genetically modify ourselves, not have the problem, the illness or whatever, or to be resilient against the viruses, the bacteria, etc., that would otherwise cause us to need drugs. Then I see the pharmaceutical industry being, and for that matter, any other need for drugs being decimated.
Have you heard?
Yeah.
Have you heard of the Shirky principle?
The what principle?
The Shirky principle.
No.
It is the idea of any organization that has its sense of profit dependent on a problem continuing to exist has no incentive to solve the overall problem. So, what?
Oh yes,
what
I understand that.
Yep. So, what incentive does Pfizer, for example, have to cure COVID-19?
Yeah, and I've made this point as well, but I'm not even really that big of a fan of using chemical compounds as a technique for trying to approach fixing ailments in the body, because all that chemical compounds do is stimulate receptors or stunt their ability to
Correct.
function. And
You're basically throwing spanners into the machine and hoping one of them happens to hit the right nut and turn it the right way.
Yeah, and as far as an approach to medicine goes, that's in practice, that's like a step above bloodletting.
Yeah.
Like it's not very. If you actually understand from a biological perspective the way most medical practices work in the body, it's pathetically underdeveloped.
Yeah.
It's stuck in the late 19th century.
It is. And Erube's law is becoming a bigger problem too, which is, it's the opposite of Moore's law, and it applies specifically in pharmaceuticals, where things are getting twice as expensive, they're taking twice as long to develop, and they're becoming half as useful or half as much of an improvement for a given time period. And that is happening time and again with pharmaceutical development because of the difficulties that they're facing with the available molecule space and how to explore it, and also the difficulties they're facing with being these huge lumbering companies and corporations that face mountains of paperwork in how they have to approach this, but also their own internal structure is working against them, and particularly profit is working against them. So
I actually perfect thing to add to what you just presented. Have you heard of the research paper about computation yet?
I think so. Isn't that to do with AI models and such to produce infinite chemical permutations, or at least as many as you can?
Here, I put it in chat. Go ahead and put the picture of that up on stream.
Oh, I see it.
This will take.
It's basically a CNC chemistry. So that would solve that problem of needing to explore the state space of possible chemical structures. Because if, say, everyone could just do chemistry at home with basically like a chemical 3D printer like this, then you wouldn't have that bottleneck anymore.
I posted a link to the article in chat.
The notion of producing drugs is still a bit of a kind of to me at least, it's not getting to the root cause of the problem. Instead, it's
Exactly.
kind of dealing with the symptoms.
I'm not talking about drugs of this. You can literally make all of the biological chemicals from scratch using this. You could make synthetic cells using this.
And
synthetic
yeah, I mean, perhaps
blood.
there'd be a way to kind of, yeah, I mean, perhaps there'd be a way to kind of build that into the body that would be of use, and so that would be something to explore. But I'm not going to call it the be all and end all because I don't think it is, but it certainly is a possibility.
It's a step in the right direction.
And we posted the picture in the stream so that people can look at it.
Alright, and first link that I posted was apparently broken, but
yeah. I think that what we face in the pharmaceutical industry in this world is the same problem that we face with the oil industry and its resistance, that it makes sure everyone else plays out, this resistance against change towards, for example, electric vehicles. And, you know, this insistence that, oh, there's still got to be a vital, useful role for oil to play. And the same goes with drugs. I think pharmaceutical corporations are going to make the same kind of arguments, the same kind of capture of the academic system that is very complete, that very much directs everyone's attention into drug development as the paradigm. And that is what we have to kind of fight the mindset of, because
yeah, it's an open secret. It's an open secret, essentially, that the heuristic that within academia determines whether or not a theory is going to get defended from an intellectual perspective and whether or not research is going to get funding is if it's consistent with the industrial practices which the political economy uses to base organization models that production is based around. And I think that...
in other words, keep up the status quo.
Yeah, and in the context of medicine, well, I think that the most glaring... this is one of the areas of research where it's most glaringly obvious that this has become an issue. As I noted, any of the fundamental techniques that all of the medical practices are based around haven't really changed over the last 100 years, and even a lot of the equipment that's used, that's been developed since the 50s, that's just entirely new technology. I don't know, like chest paddles, for example. If you look at the ones that are being used by the hospital, not only are they big and clunky pieces of equipment that look like they were designed in the 70s or the 80s, but they're also tens of thousands of dollars to obtain copies.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the same thing happens in laboratories. When you want to buy a centrifuge for a laboratory, and you want to get one that a university would actually fund, or that insurance will actually cover, the centrifuge has to cost you a couple of thousand. Why? It's because it's got to be extremely stable, it's got to be extremely shielded from if anything should happen to make it shatter. And a centrifuge, what's going to make it shatter usually is an imbalance in what it's actually spinning. Because it's spinning it so fast. It will build up such vibration that it would shatter. But the funny thing is that a lot of the potential for it to shatter is actually caused by the weight of the materials used to make it strong enough not to shatter in the first place. So it kind of becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that as it grows bigger to accommodate its own size. So that's one of the reasons why a friend of mine, back in 2011, I think it was, Cahill Garvey, came out with the Dremel fuge. It's literally an attachment for a Dremel. You 3D print it for like He said it was €2 because he was in Ireland, so that was the currency. But obviously the equivalent in dollars or in pounds or whatever. And it's literally just this little attachment. You fasten it to a Dremel multi-tool. It spins at 33,000 RPM. You can pellet DNA with it in Eppendorf tubes, and it doesn't come with a big fancy pants metal shielding box thing that it gets mounted into or anything like that. In fact, when Cahill was demonstrating it, he was demonstrating it in a tent at an event in Ireland, while another tent was being blown over by the wind in the background behind him. You can see it in the video, it's brilliant. And as he's completely just trying his best not to look at this other tent blowing over, and he's just talking to the camera as fast as he does, because Irish people, they can talk very fast when they want to. He was holding this lid from a pressure cooker in front of the Dremel fuge in a very matter-of-fact way, saying, you do want to shield yourself against it in case it should explode, because pieces will fly off this thing ridiculously fast. And it's like, this is what's taking the place of a couple of $1,000 of heavy metal that has been precisely calibrated. It's a Dremel fastened onto the edge of a table with a 3D printed stand, and it's got a 3D printed attachment on the end of it that is spinning some Eppendorf tubes around. And in those Eppendorf tubes, he's got some mushed up banana, some sodium lauryl sulfate, which is basically from washing up liquid, and some rubbing alcohol, and salt. I think those were the ingredients he used. And the result was he was able to separate DNA out. And he explained, obviously, ideally you would sort of separate off the different layers and you would keep at it a few times round until you get a more purified sample, but you get the idea, and you were able to see the layer that was the DNA just from the first spin.
It's fucking hilarious.
Yeah. And I can find you a link to the video.
$1,000 machine. Fucking Dremel for the win.
Yeah, a Dremel's like anything from $60 up to a couple of hundred, depending on which model you get. I think the ones that can go fast enough for pelleting DNA are usually around $90-something to $100 at least. Especially if you want to spin them for a while. The cheapest ones, the cheapest Dremel style multi-tools will overheat if you spin them at full speed for too long, so you're better off getting a slightly better one if you can. But overheating is obviously less of a problem than it exploding. But the way to make it not explode is to simply have another Eppendorf tube with the same amount of, ideally the same liquid, on the other side.
A counterbalance.
Yeah, it's simple enough. Don't be stupid. Make sure it's balanced. Ta-da! Spin is no problem. But Cahill said to me that in all the time he's used these Dremel fuge things, he's never had one explode. And there's been sort of multiple improved iterations been made by the 3D printing community since then, of ones that have little tilt and swivel mechanisms on them, different numbers of Eppendorf tube holders, different sizes of tubes, and different tools that you can attach them to. So they're not just for a Dremel, you can attach them to an ordinary power drill or whatever,
That's even better.
Say what?
That's even better. That's just... I'm just so amused by the greasy power tool being used to pellet DNA.
Well, there's no reason not to. That's the funny thing. As long as you maintain good sample separation from the tool itself, and good hygiene of which things you're handling when, it shouldn't be an issue.
Oh, this is what happens when industries think, "Oh, we just have to over-engineer it harder."
I'm having some slight technical issues with my internet connection, but I can at least send you a message on Discord with the search terms you can look up on YouTube.
Oh, I'd love to.
All right.
Please do shit.
I didn't. JC Armitage mentions in chat. They asked, "Does big oil really need to suppress EVs when people generally aren't adopting them? So much so that governments are mandating all cars be EVs by X number of years." I'll be perfectly upfront. At least in my case, I haven't really been following what's been going on with EVs, but just from what I've personally seen on the road and how exactly they're being implemented in practice, it looks like the technique that all of the EVs that are being manufactured in the legal economy are based around make them dependent on charging stations, which is basic. That's basically just making them dependent on oil with extra steps.
Well, I would say it's not quite that bad because you can charge them at home, and if
That's
you
if it isn't a proprietary plug.
well, the plugs are not actually proprietary. In fact, there's been a big push to make sure they're not. The standards or authorities have made sure that there's publicly available standards information before they make it a thing that is used by other manufacturers. The one
Oh, sure.
case
The
where
Standards Commission has made it so that totally
What is it?
assures me.
the Tesla connection was the one that was an outlier from that, but they have recently ratified that as a standard J3400, so that the design for it, the standards for it, how to make it are all out there. Now that doesn't make it perfect because obviously Tesla has a massive head start. They've got all those superchargers out there.
Unless I can build a car from scratch
Yeah.
using 3D printed parts, I'm not going to be as impressed.
I'm
You're going
not
to need a
ever
very
getting-
good 3D printer.
Yeah, I'm not ever buying a proprietary EV. I've
I get
literally, yeah, just all I need
just-
to see in order to deter me from that are those videos. Are those videos coming out of China of Teslas suddenly like turning in on their autopilot features? Have you seen
All right,
those?
let's just set that aside a moment, okay? Let's not assume that we're going for a particular model of EV, but let's just point out companies like Toyota have been dragging their feet when it comes to even making EVs in the first place, and they've been trying their damnedest to come up with anything but battery electric technology. They've been on about hydrogen. There's been a lot of talk about various kinds of hybrids. And in some cases, some weird esoteric fuels like ammonia. And it's like, the reason they're doing this is because the oil industry is trying to have the last laugh. It's trying to make sure that it still has some kind of fuel to sell to you that you can't easily make yourself. Because electricity, yes, you are going to want to obviously have charging stations to make life easier when you're going on your long road trips, etc., or even out of town for a little while. But when you're just doing your regular pootling around, your ordinary commute to and from work, you're probably going to be charging at home most of the time. And if you've got solar panels and a home battery, if you've got an off-grid
They're not grid anymore. Uh-oh.
you are reducing your reliance on them. And then that means they don't make money out of you. So, of course, they're going to want to see that you are buying some kind of fuel that you can't easily make yourself, because then they've got the full stranglehold on you again, like they had with fossil fuel vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's also pretty ominous for very indirect reasons, but still some that concern me, which is it would make the global fuel supply chain more dependent on West Africa, because of all of the mines that would I'm sorry, I'm just blanking on the words. The mines that would circle the resources into political supply chains that allow for the hardware in these cars to be made comes out of those regions, and why that is so concerning to
May
me.
I point something out to you?
What's that?
In a fossil fuel car, you have a whole bunch of computers and electronics that have various proprietary components these days that prevent them from being just serviced by any Joe Schmo anyway. So, all right, you can say, oh, I'm just going to stick with 1970s cars. Great. How are you going to manage to do that in the 2070s and the 2170s? At some point, you're going to have to catch up. You know.
That's the whole purpose of reverse engineering all of the tech required to make the current cars.
Yeah, and
Sure.
my problem is
and,
not
and you can
with
reverse engineer your EVs as well.
my
Now, the next
problem is
question
not.
where do you
Yeah,
get the battery chemistry from, isn't it? And the minerals.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Have
that
you studied
problem is
lithium-ion
not-
battery
Hold on,
technology?
can I finish? Can I finish?
Yeah, go ahead.
My problem is not with EVs as a technique. It's that the way it looks like from the sounds of what you're describing, they're planning on making people dependent on political economies while adopting EVs is going to make regions in West Africa key in mining resources out of. And the problem with that, and why that's so intimidating to me, is that ISIS is trying to set up a super state in that area.
Well, whoever is behind a particular location that happens to have minerals, to me, that's neither here nor there, because any technology, any particular hardware that you could make is going to require parts and minerals and things from somewhere. And you can take your pick of reasons why any of those parts, things, minerals, etc., is a problem to obtain and has political implications and ramifications. You're not going to.
Well, this doesn't take
Choose your
away
poison.
from this doesn't take away from EVs. It's just that like the propaganda model of a jihadist group is essentially just a brainwashing formula that turns somebody into the psychological equivalent of the super soldiers that you were talking about earlier. So
The
a
Western
government
propaganda model isn't.
not
Say that again?
Western propaganda models, or the Roman propaganda model, is designed to basically keep people trapped into a state of learned helplessness. Jihadist propaganda models are designed to make them psychotically angry at anything other than their own group.
I'm pretty sure that the Western, sort of, particularly in the US, but also in other countries, I've seen examples. I'm pretty sure there are plenty of cases where people are psychotically angry at anyone other than their own group, and I'm pretty sure, furthermore, that we're seeing manifestation of that right now in the government that's taking control in the US.
Yeah, well, they're definitely taking lessons from some of these propaganda models, and that's really concerning. Especially because of the fact that actual. I'm trying to think of a way of distinguishing it from Western propaganda models, but we're talking about two distinct phenomena here. And if you want a really horrifying glimpse at what, trying to frame propaganda as a behavioral discipline rather than memes that are mass propagated through media, which I would say that's probably a good way of distinguishing the Roman from the jihadist propaganda models. I mean, if I think I've brought it up a few times on past streams, but a topic of of study that I became intensely interested in over the last year, what was Democratic Kampuchea, or the Khmer Rouge movement. And they were one such group that adopted a propaganda model like this. And I'll tell you, and I could explain exactly what they did. So, in trying to contextualize a communist movement in Cambodia, they, instead of trying to present it to people in the context of Western philosophy, what they did is they modified mindfulness techniques in Buddhism. And what they did is they took one of the core mindfulness techniques in Theravada Buddhism. I've even talked about it, Sati Anatta. And they replaced Anatta with proletarianism from Marxist philosophy. So it's mindfulness of proletarian consciousness. That is the one thing that they changed that turned the turned what was developing there from just another communist movement into what
The
it
greatest
became.
genocide ever. Wrong word, not greatest, but like the most horrifying
It
genocide
stands
ever.
out. Yeah, it stands out for sure because you actually look at what you look at what's happening, and there's parallels to like Nazi Germany or the Rwandan genocide for sure. But then you start looking at you actually start studying the way that they use language, and you see that this is different. Something's different here.
Well, every scenario has its own unique sort of combination of things that brings it together, doesn't it? So obviously, you can say, oh, it's like this or that thing that happened in the past, but ultimately you are going to have a few uniquenesses to it.
And well, but that's basically from a psychological perspective. If you deconstruct that, that's what's happening. It's like they're creating a new classification of human being that's distinct from other people. Like they're creating a new mental state altogether.
Yeah, but they're doing it all for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
But that's what I would call the jihadist propaganda model. There's certainly a better, if I had more time to think about it, there'd be probably a better word to describe it, but it's important to convey that this is different than the Roman propaganda model.
All right. So then, where are we going with this?
I'm not entirely sure.
Me neither.
Well, I was trying to distinguish between propaganda models because I was trying to explain why the idea of a jihadist superstate concerns me. And then that's exactly why. A jihadist superstate with that kind of influence over the energy supply chains of political economies around the world.
Yeah, I'm pretty
Right.
sure we don't the Dune timeline.
Well, you know,
And
whether
that's
we're
what
talking
you would
about...
get.
Here's the thing. Whether we're talking about jihadists or whether we're talking about Nazis or any other scary kind of, you know, form of government or form of tyranny, the problem of a supply chain that comes mainly from a specific area is pretty obvious. So the more abundant the materials that are needed for a particular, you know, a particular hardware, a particular device, thing that people need in general, the better. And to that end, obviously, people have been trying to develop better battery technologies that don't require conflict minerals. But there's only so much you can do to sort of minimize the conflict mineral inclusion. You know, so maybe you can get rid of cobalt and reduce the amount of lithium needed, and you can switch to sodium batteries instead, and things like that. But ultimately, there's always going to be something. So you got to understand the global trade system is there, and it is going to require a certain amount of dealing with these people still happens, and that's one of the reasons I think that the interventionist sort of approach still takes place, because, you know, companies and countries all sort of realize they have this strong reliance on each other, and they have to still maintain access to these things. You know, the spice must flow one way or another, and they will keep at it. The only way you could really sort of argue against that kind of trade is a bit of a return to monkey. You know, you're going to end up with a significant reduction in your technological capability and throughput, and in your ability to keep up with what the rest of the world is doing, the other people in the world who aren't bothered by these things.
You
You
just get
take a look at what
steamrolled.
happened in you take a look at what happened in the USSR and in Cuba, for that matter, as well, technologically, when they've been embargoed and when they've been doing their own thing separately of the rest of the world. Same with North Korea as well. You finish up with peculiar, insular, backwards place where the technology is different, quite often shit, and people can't do quite the same things. So working together is obviously an essential component of a prosperous future for this world. And when I say prosperous, I don't mean in the sense of finance necessarily. I mean just in the sense of everyone being able to maximize the benefits of common knowledge and common abilities and technologies and such. They don't have to maximize that through capitalism, although they try to at the moment. They can do it through open source. They can do it through sharing and collaboration. And I think that the more we build things that are open source, the more we make them available, the more we change people's mindsets in a positive way towards that.
I actually have a different understanding of how technology trends, mainly because what's happened in the last, I would say, 400 years is that political economies past the feudalist organizational models have structured their political economies around large-scale industrial production, around geographically small and isolated areas that is incredibly easy for militaries to surround and control. This in turn has enabled mass production techniques to be incorporated back into the militaries around the world that are doing the surrounding in the first place, enabling them to be much more numerous, much more deadly, with much higher quality equipment, while also being able to be productive enough that they can outcompete their rivals. I mean, the main reason that the United States was able to overtake the Soviet Union to the extent that it did was because its organizational model was just slightly more efficient than that of the Soviet Union's. However, their organizational model, at least from my own perception, is currently at its limit in terms of how much it can finance itself and how much it can continue to shuffle money around. I mean, we're already at the point where there are multiple municipalities that just straight up don't have police departments, and even in major metropolitan areas, they just won't enforce certain laws because the fine that they could expect to gain is less than $600 or something like that. The way I see it, it's becoming increasingly difficult for the state to enforce, what are those called? Property titles on large isolated industrial modes of production, and production is now becoming more and more available to more people, and as such, production is now shifting towards a desktop model where everybody is going to become, or it's becoming more distributed, in other words, where instead of like large factories that produce everything, it's now thousands of people that produce everything, each having their own slight
Indeed.
variation, their own
Yeah.
individual ideas for what should be done, and those are the people that you usually network with. So this what's it called? This industrial revolution style of political economy, I think it's at its end, and we don't need to return to Monkey in order to be able to see its realization. All that needs to happen is the advancement of desktop production models into more and more industries and more and more availability. It'll eventually just come to the point where people can won't even need to go to work because they can just simply get what they want. I mean, it's just kind of funny nowadays because just today I was reading an article about all of the things that the that like Fortune 500 companies are trying to do to force people to get back to work. And by get back to work, they of course mean stop doing remote work and just go to these offices, because these large proprietary organizations need to be able to justify the massive amount of rent they pay on skyscraper floor space.
Mm-hmm.
So with this,
As I was saying in Discord, yeah, we no longer need to seize the means of production. Instead, we need to copy it on a community scale.
exactly.
It's the way that that's the way that it always should have been, except now it's technologically possible and on a scale small enough that most groups of friends should be able to afford it.
I mean, one of the things that we've talked about, not in this stream, of course, but in the past, is wood gasifiers. A bunch of chemists have independently developed means by which, through essentially reverse engineering a pressure cooker, you can convert wood scraps, wood pellets, and even just like, sticks in your backyard, heat them up, and you can convert them to petroleum, which can in turn be refined into things like diesel or gasoline. So you could become your own gas station.
Of course, where we're going, it'd probably be a better idea to just crack that all into hydrogen gas and then use that to fuel generators.
Yeah. I mean, we're not saying there's any, like, one thing. I mean, nobody here is opposed to electric vehicles or electric generation. One of the things that we've talked about also in the past is isolating potassium 40 from fertilizer and then using that to passively generate electricity. Of course, potassium 40 generates gamma rays, which is something that, of course, needs to be accounted for, and we don't have a complete blueprint for that for obvious reasons. But, it's an idea. And
you could take the concept of nuclear batteries and reproduce them in a safe environment for the public to access. But of course, concentrating nuclear material is something that requires a lot more specialties and safety requirements than just producing new crude oil from decomposing existing plant materials.
Mm-hmm. The point is just that
where we're going, we don't need.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Exactly.
Yeah, the future that's coming, we're probably just going to all have personal drone copters that we can just fly wherever we want.
I mean,
or maybe teleport.
Our kind of official, unofficial slogan is: social problems are technical problems. Technical problems have technical solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a slogan that we've come up with because it makes the mentality that we're approaching technique with very easily digestible. It's all social problems. All social problems are technical problems, and all technical problems have technical solutions.
So again, it's just a question.
There doesn't necessarily have to be only one solution either.
Yep.
You're technically correct. The best kind of correct.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So, question is, what flavor would you like your invulnerability to proprietary shenanigans to be in?
Oh, we'll take a little of everything, shall we?
I don't see why not.
And then share what works between each other.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna be muted for a bit. I'll be back.
I'm happy to keep on working on the gene editing aspect of it. If folks would like to help us out, and that'd be amazing. We do want to actually have some devs available on the team so that we can build out the systems properly.
Hey, well, having you on the stream here is hopefully getting the word out that you exist.
It's definitely going to be...
I hope so.
We want to get as much exposure to everyone that we can reach who is working on stuff like this, to help them get exposure and to help it develop as quickly as possible for us to be able to achieve our own individual ends.
Indeed. I think that being able to rewrite our DNA is going to be a fundamental pillar of our self-sufficiency that comes to be regarded as important to us in our near future, as Americans regard the Constitution now, if not more so, because it should be a constitutional thing to have that self-sufficiency, the ability to fix yourself and anything that you have, the ability to feed yourself and anyone else who visits or who lives with you, the ability to maintain your own shelter and to travel anywhere you want to go, and the freedom to say what you need to say without being harmful to other people in the process of saying it. Obviously,
I don't think there needs to be an official document to back any of that.
it doesn't need
Just
to be an official
personal
document.
action.
No, it should be what people rather nebulously refer to as common sense. It should be something that is just understood by everyone.
Fortunately, that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
The,
It
the,
should be
the
something
idea-
that is just understood by everyone as the obvious thing that is right. But in practice, of course, you are dealing with a society that loves to find loopholes for the sake of finding loopholes, and that loves to be greedy for the sake of greed. And so you've really got to spell it out to people, because there's always bloody someone who wants to ruin it for everyone else.
Well, that's why I framed our method as I did, as a means of achieving invulnerability. Because whether we like it or not, those kinds of people are going to exist for one reason or another. At least that's my expectation. So, the question is, how do we make those people just completely irrelevant? I know you didn't literally mean like a constitution, as in like a written document. The way I see it, though, it's the only constitution that is really necessary is the actions that are performed by us in utilizing these techniques and technologies and leveraging them in such a way as to fit our ends. We don't need
We
to
should
write
be
anything
able,
down. We should just be able to demonstrate
Yeah.
our means.
not only that, but we should be able to demonstrate it in such a way that makes it absolutely obvious that this collection of abilities to self-actualize and to self-support it's the obvious way to go, because it's so achievable, so easily within reach, and so much simpler and easier than the alternatives.
My mindset is just that I don't know how familiar you are with Cody Wilson, Defense Distributed.
I'm not.
He's the guy who came up with the first fully 3D printed firearm, the Liberator, and
Right.
his rhetoric whenever he's doing interviews with mainstream or second stream media is always just along the lines of, yes, I design 3D printed guns and I make the blueprints freely available to everybody. These exist now. You got to get used to it. Because once these technologies are available, they're going to exist and people are going to experiment with them. The state, I mean, it'll probably be months or even years before they can even muster up a response, because their reaction time is really, really slow. But even if they do try to suppress it or ban it or regulate it, people will have already done a lot of experimentation and modification such that their role in that relationship between people and the means they have of being able to achieve their own genetic self-actualization will be as an antagonist. Point is that we want to get to the point where genetic modification being available for the average Joe, it just exists and people are going to have to get used to it. They're going to whine, they're going to scream, they're probably going to scream for insert politician here to ban it. But it's still going to exist, and there's really not a damn thing they're going to be able to do about it because people will just share the information, share the data, and even if they somehow
Well, the cat will be out of the bag.
Sorry? Yeah, exactly. You can't put that
cat
genie
will be
back
out
in the
the bag.
bottle. Even if they somehow manage to get rid of every single instance of an individual having the files on their computer, or having the machines on their desktop, that still means that the technique is known about and exists. You can get rid of the physical technology, yeah, but people are now going to have a point of reference for how to use it and how it works, how it exists at all. And as such, they're going to know exactly what they're aiming for when they want to reverse engineer the technology back into existence again. It's kind of the same phenomenon that I've considered with the internet, where you try to develop the internet the first time, yeah, you don't know what you're doing. I mean, you kind of have a general idea, but no one really knows what it is,
This
what to
brings
do.
me to...
Sorry, I just want to finish my point real quick here.
Yep.
Don't know what it is, what to do, or how to use it. But once people have gotten used to it over decades of usage and have developed their lifestyles around it and have a relationship with it, even if the internet were to go down tomorrow, the internet, at least in some form, will be restored within a year tops because the technique already exists and people know generally how it works.
Yeah, and that resilience is extremely important, and is a kind of commonality of distributed systems, and that's a blessing, absolutely, and it's what the internet and the World Wide Web do. But I also want to point out that we have a philosophy in Put Together, which is the overarching group behind Vulpine Labs. We call it Zaravashta. It is a type of approach to scientific and engineering development, and the best way to describe it is as like a landscape. You have the mainland of the mundane, where most people are in terms of their knowledge of what's going on, scientifically, technologically, where we're all at. And most people live comfortably there, and they don't really put too much mind to what else lies beyond. If someone asks them, they'll say what they think is out there, but that's all. Then you have the peninsula of empiricism, which is attached to the mainland of the mundane by the isthmus of science communication. And at the peninsula of empiricism, you have all your scientists hacking away at empirical data, trying to make a case for presenting it to people
All right,
so
hey,
that they can understand it as a mundane thing.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just have to let everybody know that I have to go deal with something, so I'm probably going to be out for the rest of the stream. First and hopefully only time that I'm going to have to do this. But yeah, Doug will be here to continue for me.
Best of luck.
All right, good luck.
All right. Be here.
Yeah, take care. So, to continue the analogy, the mainland of the mundane gradually gains mass as the peninsula of empiricism grows on it, and the isthmus of science communication widens as scientists get a bit better at communicating what the hell is going on scientifically to the masses. But at the end of the day, they're only very gradually able to expand it because they have their limits as to what they can imagine and where they can get to. And when you get down to the edge of that empirical peninsula, you reach the rocks of hypothesis and the sandbars of conjecture that are spread into the waves at the edge of the sea of impossibility. And when the scientists are looking out there at the sea of impossibility, all they see is impossibility. They don't really see a whole lot else out there except for the odd conjecture sandbar showing over the waves occasionally. And so they may try to strike out towards those conjectures, but they don't know which one's going to get them anywhere. They see a lot of them as dead ends. But they occasionally try and see which one is stable enough to support some kind of hypothesis and eventually to build out that peninsula a bit further onto. But it's all very small incremental progress. and it takes a long time. What we like to see put together, though, is a more sort of leaping forward, more of a kind of innovative, what's the word? Ability to take a chance and to take a leap into the unknown. For that, you have to be able to find the islands of possibility that are out there in the sea of impossibility. And those islands may well be far beyond the horizon that the scientists can see from the shores of the peninsula of empiricism. So the scientists are saying, you're mad if you think there's anything out there. We can't see anything out there. What are you talking about? We're focused laser sharp on just getting to that Sandbar conjecture over there. That's not very far out at all. We believe we can achieve it by putting a few rocks here and a few rocks there of our hypothesis until we can gradually build out our empiricism further with papers about this particular subject matter. But we're not going to be trying anything in the deep water. That's crazy. And what we have to say to them is, look, where we're going, the water isn't as deep. And they'll say, okay, how do you know that? You'll see. We get in our aeroplane of ability to actually use our imagination and creativity. We get out there to the island of possibility of a particular method, a particular technique, a particular technological leap that people couldn't think of, couldn't possibly conceive, and build a bridge of engineering back from that to the scientists on their peninsula, or indeed directly to the mainland of the mundane, and we say, look, here is how you actually achieve these things, here's how you actually do this. And then the scientists can say, okay, that's interesting, now we can document this, we can make papers about it and so on, because they actually have a direction to go in. But sometimes you've got to make those leaps to actually be able to show, okay, this is how this thing works. And there have been several examples of that through history. Things like the discovery of penicillin, which was quite an accident, really, and you know, the phenomena of electricity, and of how to build a good microscope. Things like that, they required certain leaps of faith to be taken when it came to developing new ideas and technologies that the existing establishment didn't really fully support or understand until they saw an example of it, until they had something to actually hold and say, aha, now I can see what's happening here. And I feel that we need to consider when we're looking at gene editing, when we're looking at the potential things that you can do with it, and with other such technologies that we reach into the future, you know, things like telepathy, teleportation, and so on and so forth. How we actually are going to get there is not by looking at it just from where we're standing now. We've got to imagine what it's going to be like to look back from actually being there at how we got there. We've got to sort of picture we're already being there and say, okay, how do we build that bridge back from where we want to be to where we are now? And that, doing it that way round can seem counterintuitive. It can seem back to front to scientists, but it's essential, I think, to being able to make these leaps and then actually connect them back to people's understanding.
Well, isn't that the point of fiction?
That is a major point of science fiction and a few other kinds of fiction indeed. And they provide the groundwork quite often for at least having the ideas of
I mean,
where
heck,
to look
did
for
the
these
cell phone
islands.
come from people try to copy the tricorder?
Sort of. Although some of the... I believe some of the earliest examples, obviously they were using things like mobile radios that were developed for, you know, use in the battlefield, things like that. So I think there was a certain amount of technologies leaning on older technologies. You know, everything's standing on the shoulders of giants.
Mhm.
And so it's a matter of how much of a leap was any given step from the previous one, as to whether you think it was really that much of a change to warrant that kind of approach. But I would argue that if it's enough to make scientists literally write letters to you and whole, articles and posts saying that your ideas are impossible and that you should be shunned, then that is an example of something where if you are certain you do have a way to do it that you've just got to actually articulate, and you haven't been able to articulate it yet, and that's an example of something that you're in the position of applying Zarathustra to, where they are not yet going to get it until you have done. And it's an irritating position to be in, because in the end you're going to be able to have an "I told you so" moment, but only after you've managed to actually build that bridge, which is often an expensive and time-consuming thing to do, and would be a whole lot easier if people would actually give you a chance. If people would actually say, okay, I'll suspend my disbelief. I don't know that there's an island of possibility out there, but I'd sure like to see if there is or isn't. I'd sure like to see whether this idea works or not, and so I'm going to help you and take that risk.
That's what I did.
Yeah. And I thank you for that. And, I think that we need more people who are in these academic positions where they've got the knowledge to realise that their knowledge doesn't have to be tied to a very narrow tunnel vision approach. It can be
People are
used in
over-specialized.
Yeah.
They forgot how to be generalists.
Exactly. And so they're forgetting how to use their imaginations as well.
Because they're not making connections, cross-pollinating ideas. I mean, here, I'll give you another really good example of this. Do you know how the microwave oven was invented?
As I understand it, it was because of a particularly powerful radar dish.
Yes, it was. A particularly powerful radar dish that happened to melt somebody's bar of chocolate in his pocket when tuned to a specific frequency. And then what they found is that that specific frequency of microwaves resonates water molecules like a tuning fork. So if you made a microwave coil to emit specifically that frequency in a little container that bounces it like a standing wave in there, then you can heat any food that has water in it.
I believe it was a military base, and it became a popular practice for people who wanted to reheat their food to just leave whatever food they wanted at that particular radar dish for a minute or two.
That's brilliant.
It also reminds me of another story that I read off of the internet once about how somebody somebody thought, you know what, the radar dish is actually a microwave emitter, so why don't I just take a fishing line and try and lower my popcorn pan in front of it. And then it exploded. And then, so apparently the story went that for about 1 second, a 20-mile large object appeared on the radar. Everyone was freaked out, and apparently that created a false UFO report.
That's probably what Independence Day was based on.
I'll be right back.
If you recall, the UFOs from
Glad I
those
made you
movies were
laugh.
gigantic.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, that's primarily the reason why, at least within our circles, we don't try to appeal to academics or seek to court their attention, because fundamentally the colleges and universities, they're proprietary organizations too, entirely dependent on property titles enforced by the state, who receive funding not only from the state but various corporate and special interest groups in order to
And not just
whatever
that.
kind of sorry.
Yeah, not just that, but they're also very married to dogma, because that dogma suits their whole model. And so you have scientists who, they want to maintain their jobs. They have tenure, and they want to keep it, and so they will chase whatever form of research best fits that model of keeping them, in a cushy place.
Yeah. No one's in a hurry to put themselves out of a job, at least unless they're trying to get fired. Which, given what college professors have to do, honestly, it doesn't seem like that bad of a gig.
It's often very long hours for them.
Probably,
but
if you're in that position, you're probably an avid researcher anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this.
When I was at university in Southampton, this was 2013 to 16. I was doing biochemistry, and I spoke to Dr. Mark Caldwell, who was he was very much an expert on mRNA to protein translation, and he said to me when I was talking about the idea of full-blind labs and what I wanted to do with it, that I would be better off going into industry really than trying to carry on working on the gas, and even just the first module of it that I want to develop, initiate a set with, which is mRNA to protein translation. He was saying, like, if I carry on trying to do that in academia, what I'm going to finish up with isn't the guess, but instead it's going to be somebody else's work that I have to do before I can get anywhere near working on the guess properly. Because unless I can persuade some senior professor who probably already has a lifetime of work sort of lined up in their mind of what they want to do, which is, going to be a lot more incremental and a lot more surefire thing. Unless I can persuade them to change their mind and start working on my work, my ideas, which isn't very likely at all, then I'd be ending up having to work on theirs. If I wanted to carry on, doing a master's and a PhD and postdoc sort of work. So, he was like, no, you're better off going into industry. That's going to suit you better. And do me trying for years to get anywhere in industry and failing miserably because I couldn't really mesh with the whole capitalist model.
Yeah, I can see why. Your only real options here that are presented to you according to pressures created by the state is to engage in one proprietary organization or another, whether that be politics, business, or academic. It's all just a bunch of circle jerking about who's trying to figure out new ways to screw other people out in order to engage in profits or engage in rent seeking on behalf of a sense of profit that is defined exclusively by the central banks. Which
exactly, and so you can see why I feel so. Yeah, and so you can see why I feel so jaded and disappointed in the set of options laid out before me when I'm trying to make something so altruistic as full-blind labs happen.
Of course, it only makes sense that you would see that and just be like, yeah, there's gonna be something better.
Exactly. So I realized, I've got to do this in a way that doesn't need currency so much in the first place. In a way that doesn't need for the huge amount of resources that a startup company would even use, or a pharmaceutical company or anything else. And instead, I've got to do this in the scrappy sort of low resource way that I want to see other people being able to do it. The development process itself has to be on as low a budget the people who are end users are going to be on. And that is to say almost nothing. Almost no money at all, really. and very low resource availability, and those resources we do have got to be very domestic resources, very easy to find. And so these constraints obviously are the sort of thing that would put off a lot of people who would claim that, well, it's already very difficult to discover or make anything new, even if you're in a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical firm, but of course they're looking at Eroom's law. They're not looking at a Zaravashta kind of approach. So I believe we do have some tricks up our sleeve along the lines of not deluding ourselves by putting blinkers on, like so many in industries exist today do, and so many in academia do. Instead, what we're doing is we're saying, look, the rules and regulations were built by these industries to maintain these industries and their status, and by academia to maintain academia and its status. The existing paradigm of journal publications is built to maintain the status quo as well. And so are all the rules and regulations, all the things that are supposed to, quote-unquote, keep people safe. Yes, they have some convincing arguments to say why they keep people safe. But at the end of the day, in order to actually get to the point where the people have what they need, and where that which people have and need is safe for them to use at home, safe for them to be self-sufficient with, we have to be ready to take some personal risks on our part in ways that don't make the risk bigger, that don't expand it out to everyone else, in order to actually achieve the development of what we are trying to develop without having to use resources we're simply never going to have, because the system will deprive us of them anyway.
You know what?
Yeah?
I totally agree. And you know what? There's a perfect example of this in history, too. Do you want to know how ulcers were found out how they actually work? Turns out that because in the U.S. they ban human testing, even if it's voluntary, the only way to figure out what caused ulcers was for a scientist to say, "Fuck it, I'm going to test on myself," and then cultured a specific bacteria or virus, and then consumed it.
Yeah.
To then discover what specifically was causing ulcers. And he was right. It worked. And he was able to not only figure out exactly what vector was biological vector was causing the phenomena of ulcers, but to then reverse it and cure it. Because he took the risk of testing on himself.
Yes. Now here's the kicker, right? Because everybody has a unique genome, and because the existing systems paradigm wants every new drug to be tested for years before it gets released into the market. For one, we shouldn't allow gene edits to be individually treated as drugs anyway, but the system will try to do that. And currently it does try to do that, right? And that's one of the reasons why gene edits currently are not very efficacious, is because they only work on the people whose genomes they happen to match.
Exactly.
Which isn't really everybody, right? So, if you consider that everyone has a unique genome, and if you want to make a complex set of changes, then that complex set of changes is probably going to be unique to you. Then everybody has to self-experiment. That's the only way you're going to get anything done when it comes to curing genetic disorders. If you want to actually, if you want to actually get through the way the system works now, at least. Alternatively, we've got to break the law, and probably in very unethical ways at that. I'd rather not go down that route. I would rather go down the route of it being freedom of form and people having their own agency and choice in these things, and people actually having the ability to test these things on themselves, because then, it's much less reliance on systems, organizations, and so forth, institutions that could easily be turned against you or simply stop working for you because something went wrong. So that's where this self-reliance factor really comes into its own. We need to develop this gene editing system in a way that anyone can build it, anyone can do it, and we need to do it on a tight budget ourselves. Really appreciate and achieve that, so that it actually works for everyone. And this is why Cathal Garvey's Dremelfuge comes up as an example to me, is because he took something that was $2,000 and he turned it into $2 or euros or whatever. Why not? What was stopping that happening sooner was a kind of collection of dogmatic assumptions. If we can discard those dogmatic assumptions and really go back to first principles in how we're developing a system like this, we can achieve a fuck ton more than a lot of people would expect. First start, developing the guest. It's all software. All you need is a computer and an internet connection, ideally. And that's basically it for that. So you don't need a lab to develop the guest itself. The geneticizer, you do need to test it. You do need to be able to make sure it works. And you need to be able to build it in a way that is reasonably clean and doesn't get too noisy, at least initially while you're testing it. But you need it to be capable of being used in the field. You need it to be something that people can use at home. And home is a very messy and noisy place, especially in some types of homes. So maybe we shouldn't be taking the clean room approach so much, because that might actually be detrimental to our ability to make the system resilient. Instead, we should be designing it to cope with noise, and designing our own processes of development to cope with noise, and testing to cope with noise, and mess, and contaminants, and things that get in the way. It's essential to have this much sort of more what's the word? This much more sort of mucky, really, and unhygienic, and scrappy kind of set of standards for what your lab should be like, because it's more realistic to the real world that your systems are going to be engaged in. And when your systems are designed to cope with that right from the outset, then I think you're in a stronger position to make something safer, actually, because then it's less likely to fail at critical times, just because some little bit of dust got into the system. Say, for example, you're trying to save somebody's life in the desert. There's going to be dust. It's an unavoidable thing. You can't build a clean room at the drop of a hat when someone's life needs saving as soon as possible. So that's my kind of thinking on this. Obviously, yes, you're going to want to make it at least somewhat clean. Want to try to minimize the noise, because then you're going to get better results. Your system has to be tolerant of some noise and some mess. It has to be able to cope with that without ruining what you're working on.
Makes sense, and I think it's very encouraging that you're even considering that.
Well, at the end of the day, the more you make it sensitive, and the more you make it really, really highly strung about mess and noise, the more expensive it will be in this world's current paradigm. The more difficult it will be anyway in any paradigm to actually achieve the conditions necessary to build it and use it. And that will naturally then tend towards those with the most resources in the first place. The rich.
Yep.
Being able to do it, or not being able to do it. Obviously, we don't want to be in that scenario. We want to be in a scenario where even the poorest people on the planet are in with a chance of being able to build one of these things and use it. if they at least are able to access some basic resources. Even if they don't literally own those resources themselves, maybe in a pinch they can steal them, or find some way to obtain them.
We just homestead the resources.
We just what? Sorry.
Homestead the resources.
Yeah, that's my point. The resources should be achievable that way, but I don't think that somebody who is living on a homestead is the poorest person on the planet, because they have that homestead, and a homestead gives them and a degree of independence that is worth more than money or gold. I think that the poorest people on the planet are the ones who have been so shafted by the system and are continuing to be shafted by the system in such a way as they can't actually get to the point of having resource independence. Those are the people who need the most help. Ones that are stuck on the streets and forever being harassed and having their meager resources taken away from them in fines and in, theft and being moved on and having their tents burned down and things like that by the police or whatever. Those are the people who are going to be the hardest to reach, I think, in some respects, in terms of making these things available to them.
They're going to be the ones that have the most use for it.
Yeah, that's the thing. And so we've got to be prepared to actually go there, to the places where these people are and help them ourselves, to help to right that imbalance, to make that final bridge to the people who can't build these systems for themselves, and maybe don't know anybody who has one. So
have you taken a look at the open source ecology project?
Not as a project per se. Would you like to give a link, or are you talking about within your group? Is it a project you have or a project that someone else has?
It's a project that somebody else has.
Then in that case, yes, a link, please.
I'm going to post it right in here. Because one of the things that I wanted to introduce you to was this project. Especially, not only that, but remember how I already introduced you to HackerFab?
Yeah.
The point of introducing you to open source ecology and HackerFab together was to show you that if you developed both of these tool sets together, you would be able to secure the entire supply chain for building a biology lab from scratch.
Potentially so, although I do think that the amount of time and effort and brain power it's going to take for any individual is going to be formidable anyway. But at least
you're not alone anymore, are you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're not alone anymore, are you?
Well, indeed, that's the upside. If we can build groups and communities of people who can complement each other with these abilities and understandings and resources and so forth.
That was the point of me seeking you out and meeting you, was seeing that potential as a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
To forge an alliance in the first place, because I saw that that was what was needed to make the connection between the future where everyone gains direct access to their own biology and self-sufficiency, from basically being able to create an entire supply chain of self-sufficiency from the ground up for anyone.
Indeed. And that includes the logistics.
Exactly.
It includes being able to physically reach those people who aren't really part of the conversation yet, but ought to be, because they're in the position where they need it the most. And
I mean, that was also the reason that I was really attracted to the idea of your Volpe bus, because something that Esso and I, and, well, not just us, but a lot of people in our groups have found attractive is the idea of converting school buses into RVs or converting vans into RVs and then moving around to where we're needed.
And the idea with the Vulpibus is it is this school bus that we're converting into a motorhome, laboratory, hackerspace, and possibly rescue vehicle occasionally, all in one. And it's taking us a while to build it out because, well, resources don't always come in the order that you need them to. But we're getting there gradually, bit by bit. And as we work on it, we can expand our skills and our abilities, but we can also continue to work on the software side of things in between things. And we can eventually, when we have this built enough to take it places, we can start to use the lab in wherever we need to drive to, wherever we need to go, wherever we're needed by people. And so we'll be able to bring the initial prototypes of the geneticizer to test, at larger facilities if needed. Excuse me, if those become available to us. But if they don't, that's no big deal. It just would be handy. But we can also bring it then, once we have better versions, to the people who need the actual gene edits to apply, and we can show those people how to use it. We can say this is something that everyone can learn how to do because it's so straightforward in the interface design. Obviously, there will be some outlier cases. There'll be some people who don't want to learn it or can't learn it on how to use the gene editing systems, and they may feel unfairly left out by their own difficulties with understanding and learning such a highly technical thing, even if it is relatively simple. They'll be in that similar category to where the Silver Surfers were in the 90s. The old people who had difficulty understanding how to press the power button on the computer, let alone use a keyboard and a mouse.
Which is fine.
So there will be
other
that
people who can
bridge.
help them. I would like to believe.
Yeah, exactly. There will be that bridge of difficulty to get across, which means that, like we're still not quite in a paperless society now. We still have certain esoteric things that require the old-fashioned systems. That's going to happen, I think, with medicine as well. It's still going to have a coexistence for a long while of people trying to do it the old way, with pharmaceutical drugs, and people who are ready to actually just edit their genes so that they don't need those drugs. And there will be some people who will be like, look, can you please just do this for me? And that'll actually be one of the most difficult questions to answer, at least legally speaking. But if somebody is ready and willing, to make certain changes to themselves, then you have to sort of work out what is, in that scenario, the most ethically right thing for you to do in response. Is it to say, look, you need to teach yourself this? Or is it to say, well, we've got like 3 or 4 of us here already who know what we're doing with this system, so sure, we'll help you out, but, it has to be according to exactly what you want.
There's not going to be a right or wrong answer in these scenarios. It's going to come. Ultimately, what's going to happen is a value judgment based on the context of any given situation. There's going to be people who are willing to learn. They might ask for help, and you could use it as a teaching opportunity to explain step by step what you're doing and how you're doing it. And then there's going to be people who want you to teach them, but they just don't learn.
Mm-hmm.
For one reason, for an infinite number of reasons, of course. But the point is that the technology is available, and the people who don't like it, they're going to have to live with it. And what people do or do not do with it is entirely up to them. Maybe they'll use it to its full potential and come up with all sorts of crazy things. Maybe they'll use it casually. Maybe they'll never use it in their entire life and they'll die of old age when it could have been avoidable. That's fine. That's up to them. It was their decision.
But they should at least have the choice.
Exactly. That's the important
That's
thing
the
here.
point.
Like, what I was talking about this in the group chat before we started about kind of the problem I have with what's mentioned on TV tropes as who wants to live forever, where it's framed in a lot of fiction, how immortality is just like this horrific curse where, yeah, you live forever, but all of these other terrible things come with it. Maybe you have to live with the fact that you're a vampire and you're functionally a parasite on other people. Or maybe it's like you physically cannot die no matter what you do. But I just can't help but think to myself that there are so many ways in which this could easily be avoided just by, instead of just like trying to make yourself literally unkillable, you make it so that death becomes a choice rather than an inevitability. Which is ultimately just what we're doing. We're empowering people to, or we seek to empower people so that they have the choice of whether or not they want to die, rather than having that choice be made for them by their rotting cage of biomatter.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question: would you
There
like
is obviously
would you like the cage to not rot?
Would you like the cage to no longer be a cage?
I would like to be able to change it so that I get to set whether it rots or doesn't and for how long it takes to do so, if it does. Put it that way.
Yeah. Give people the choices, the tools, the autonomy. And the people who don't like it, well, that's up to them. Where we're going, we're not going to need roads, so they have no way of being able to follow us.
It's about how other people live.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
What gives them the right to make claims about how other people live?
Well,
That's a question that you can ask every religion as well.
well, I
Pretty
mean,
much.
like way earlier, like very early on the stream, there was a question from Russian Capitalist. Thoughts on Christianity? So I'm kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are.
My thoughts on Christianity.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, don't worry about offending us.
Well, to put simply, I think Yahweh is unfortunately a bit of an asshole, and he made some rather strange mistakes, and that led to significant misinterpretations being made by people that got written down into a bunch of books, and then those books got shuffled, mismatched, and only some of them actually used to make this thing we call the Bible. And it was based on political rather than, specifically the truth, but more political needs at the time. And that, led to a lot of misinterpretation of who Jesus is or was, who Yahweh was or is, and all the rest of the people involved. And then, you multiply that by centuries upon centuries of political will, infighting, dogma, arguments, isms, and empires rising and falling. And what you end up with is this ridiculous mess we have today that can barely even stand to call itself one religion, because it's got so many different versions of itself. It's kind of a bit like with Linux. You've got so many different versions of Linux, but they're all ostensibly built around the same kernel, and yet they're not all actually, because when you look deep down, they've all modified it different ways. And you look at Christianity, and if you look deep enough, you can see they've all done different things with the Bible. They've done different things with prayer, with the purpose of it all, with what message it is they're trying to get across to the people, based on the machinations of political bullshit over the years in different places. And they all claim that, oh, we never modify the Bible. That it's absolutely sacrosanct. It never changes. Really.
Well, they don't change the
Sorry, but
they don't change the Bible. What they do is they change what books are canon to the Bible.
now that is changing the Bible. Don't mess it about that. Just call a spade a spade. They changed the Bible
Mac,
to
we
suit
back.
needs, and that's where you've got your current mess that is Christianity from. It's just people worshipping a collection of political motives.
The primary.
Oh, we're talking about.
Yep.
Oh, we're talking about how the Trinity is a state of mind that can be deconstructed from a cognitive semiotic perspective, how Buddhism and a couple of other systems of spirituality recreated the exact same construct, and also how the Empire
That's
never
not what I'm
ended.
talking about at all. No, that's not what I'm talking about at all. I was getting to that afterwards, but I mean, the Trinity, for a start, could easily have been a misinterpretation of somebody having a plural headspace. With multiple entities in the same head. That can be written about in so many ways that the Bible is, when it talks about the Trinity, that's one potential answer to that question. Certainly, I've met enough people who have multiple personalities and some very interesting identities to some of those personalities to know that that's entirely plausible.
I mean, there's. What were you going to say? Well, even Judeo-Christianity describes it as a state of mind. It's just they portray it as though it's the product of a supernatural force that causes it. It's something that it's something that is just given through divination, and divination is a supernatural phenomenon. But the thing is that the Gnostic representation of the Trinity, as well as I alluded to, this concept in Buddhism, which is called the Triple Gem in the context of Buddhism, is a state of mind that can be deconstructed from a cognitive semiotic perspective, and that's but that's basically what it is. Is the in Buddhism, it's the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. But in the context of Gnostic Christianity and Judeo-Christianity, it's the Christ, the Father, and the Spirit. And if you compare how it's represented in the context of Buddhism, well, all of those concepts are not only fairly well understood, but they're presented as repeatable methods that people can employ and practice through mindfulness techniques.
Yeah, well, you can also say that these religions will, quite happily copy ideas from each other when they feel like it's a useful thing to do, either for political or just practical ends. But
basically, what it is
holes in their existing system.
But basically, what it is it's you have to approach the concept like you're looking at perception from the perspective of how it's formed, like how it's created, and then how that goes on to influence the function of the brain. Spirituality is basically like psychoanalysis, except it approaches from the perspective of programming the brain through narrative rules because of how the brain processes aesthetic. And what this Trinity concept is, and why so many systems have it, is they're narrative rules that, by defining them in any system and giving them specific rules, allows you to program a new state of mind, like a new state of consciousness.
Oh,
it's a consciousness that has its rules defined by the system of spirituality it's contextualized by. the Christ, the Buddha, the consciousness, the Father or the Dharma, the disciplines or the ability to enact behavior, and the spirit or the Sangha, which is in the context of Buddhism, community. So in not just community, but an environment where the other two of the Trinity can be maintained. So it's very similar to the way that Neoplatonists portray the concept of spirit.
I mean, whether you want to frame it that way or not, meditation is something I can recommend to anyone to sort of find their own path of spiritual understanding. And if you discover it as a Trinity kind of concept, interesting, but bear in mind you could have been influenced obviously by the notion of it from previous religious encounters, etc.
Well, there's a predecessor to Judeo-Christianity that's a Gnostic sect that would have been active in the region that Christianity emerged out of. That's called Mendeism, and it's a Gnostic system that's more focused on what Gnostics called Adamas, which is the spirit, like the first person, the first human to attain self-awareness, the spiritual father of humanity. And this system, Mendeism, explicitly portrays Jesus, the Jesus character, as a Buddha. And it portrays them as being the same concept, the Christ and the Buddha. So, I mean, and that system predates the mixing of Jewish mysticism into Christianity. But that's basically the main thing that changed is Jewish mysticism started being employed in Christian belief systems, and there's a concept in that's discussed at great length called the unwritten law of heaven. And if you look at how that concept is portrayed, it makes the representation of all of these previously Gnostic concepts as supernatural phenomena make perfect sense, because it's designed specifically to oblate your ability to understand it without some sort of rite of passage. It makes it so...
that's the thing. Whatever the original meditations and discoveries were that people made in the start, which may well have carried in some of the writings, the way that they were framed since then has been deliberately manipulated to make it so that it's a mode of controlling people.
Yeah, and
in kind of organized religion these days.
And it's actually kind of unbelievable, because if you look at the church as an organization, the Catholic Church or any organized church's narrative of why Judeo-Christianity is the accurate interpretation, they'll usually cite the Acts of the Apostles. And what most people don't realize is that the Acts of the Apostles, first of all, the earliest historical documented evidence of it being a part of Christianity comes from a text called Against the Heresies, written by a bishop named Irenaeus. And the purpose of that text was specifically to try to discredit the Gnostic interpretation of Christianity. And you can go ahead and read a lot of the arguments for yourself. This would not fly by any standard of what counts as a refutation. I mean, first of all, there's the fact that he was a bishop in the Roman Church, trying to discredit Gnosticism's narrative. That's like the most glaring conflict of interest that one could think of. But then there's just what his arguments are, and it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But anyway, if you just read how the Acts of the Apostles became canonized, simply by what they themselves state and also what the church states. Well, it's after Peter and Paul, the disciples following Jesus, ascended to heaven. Peter and Paul, quote unquote, two other people who were using those names as archetypes to represent themselves, come along and say, hey, actually, Judas isn't a disciple, Matthias is a disciple. And then Matthias adds the entire New Testament, and this happens in the stated time frame where the church states that this occurred, right around the time that the Roman Empire was conducting a mass purge against intellectuals.
Hmm.
And the way that the Acts of the Apostles were spread was by the gospel being spread by the church, and it was the Coptic Church of Egypt and the Church of Rome mainly conspiring together in that historically documented purge. So yeah, the history of Christianity just reads like a crime scene, even by the church's own narrative.
I have an experience that I'd like to share. Because my family is Christian, I got dragged to a Catholic church for a mass last Christmas, and I had a lot of this context already cognizant in my mind when I went there, and I couldn't help but come out of that, like even experiencing it at the moment, just thinking to myself, God is not here, because I was experiencing all of that those usual theatrics, the singing, the sermons, and all of that. I just couldn't help but reflect on everything I knew about cults and the thought-stopping techniques and cliches and behavioral control that they use, specifically to prevent people from being able to think, to meditate, to have moments to themselves, and to, in the context of Christianity, be able to cultivate their own relationship with God, whether they consider God to be a higher sense of self or some external supernatural force.
Yeah, one of the practices I noticed that they often carry out in churches is they always rather handily tell you what and who to pray for, and how, they even lead you along in the words of the prayer. They don't leave it up to you to meditate on that yourself in a completely separate way. They tell you what a prayer is, which somewhat defeats the point of a ability to really learn or commune with the universe, so to speak, on a personal level.
That's the point of the unwritten law of heaven. You're supposed to be put into a suggestive state by just going along with it and trusting. And then that's when your fucking psyche gets programmed with all of the manipulative rules that they want you to internalize.
Mm-hmm. So I hope that answers the question about Christianity there, then.
Yeah. But anyways,
I kind of came...
Sorry?
Yeah, I kind of came into the end of that, but as you could probably tell, I have a lot to say on the topic, and the video I'm working on does say a lot about the topic.
Yeah. Anyways, I think we can wrap it up here.
Alright. Well, see you all later, everybody.
Yep. Thank you for coming on, and
yeah, there's always going to be more to talk about, but for now, I think that's enough for tonight. Take care, everyone.
Yep, and if you're interested, feel free to look up Vulpine Labs. We'll be sure that you can see links in the chat. Well, I'm just looking through the chat right now, and yeah, there's a link to the GitHub for the guests, which we were talking.
GitLab.
Yeah, GitLab. Sorry. So yeah, feel free to check that out and let us know your thoughts.